Some massive endings are beautifully written in permanent ink, but others are violently, brutally, carved directly into the bone. The heavy courthouse aggressively smelled of ancient wood and violently broken promises. Logan Vance sat perfectly, terrifyingly still, his massive hands tightly clasped completely over the highly polished mahogany table, intensely watching the beautiful woman directly in front of him, the exact woman who used to be his loving wife, agonizingly signing her name on the absolute last page. The heavy pen violently scratched the thick paper, a highly agonizing sound that seemed deafeningly louder than it absolutely should have been. Significantly louder than the heavy clock aggressively ticking on the wall, infinitely louder than his own massive heartbeat, louder than the highly muffled, toxic whispers of other shattered couples, desperately waiting their pathetic turn to legally, permanently, and exactly what they had once fiercely sworn would beautifully last forever. She absolutely did not look up at him, even a single, microscopic time. Her soft hand violently trembled slightly as she painstakingly wrote. He could vividly see it. The exact, painful way her delicate fingers aggressively gripped the heavy pen, way too incredibly tightly. Exactly how she desperately had to firmly hold her own wrist completely with her other hand. Exactly as she absolutely always did, whenever she was frantically, desperately attempting not to violently cry. When she finally, agonizingly finished, she smoothly slid the heavy legal papers completely across the wooden table, directly toward him. And the highly grating sound they aggressively made against the wood was exactly like something violently dying. Exactly like the absolute final, ragged breath completely abandoning a broken body. He had aggressively asked for this. He had violently pushed for it. He had made it incredibly, brutally clear. Their massive marriage was permanently over. And now, here they officially were. Logan aggressively snatched the expensive pen completely before she could ever miraculously change her mind. Completely before she could softly say absolutely anything that might violently make him doubt the massive decision he had spent agonizing months arrogantly convincing himself was 100% correct. The exact same decision his elite business partner, Miles Preston, aggressively repeated was highly necessary. That he absolutely could not successfully move his massive corporate empire forward while heavily dragging the crushing weight of a catastrophic, failed marriage. He signed incredibly fast, highly decisively, exactly like violently ripping off a bloody bandage. The dark ink slightly, messily bled entirely onto the thick paper, and exactly just like that, absolutely everything was violently, permanently over. All the beautiful years, all the massive, unbreakable promises, all the highly intimate late-night conversations entirely about the beautiful future they would fiercely build completely together, the beautiful children they happily talked about, the massive dreams they beautifully shared. Absolutely all of it, brutally reduced entirely to exactly 2 pathetic signatures on a cold legal document that would be permanently shoved into some dusty government office and completely forgotten. She confidently stood up immediately, completely before he could utter a single word, completely before he could pathetically offer some highly empty, toxic consolation that they would both be significantly better off. That this was undeniably the absolute right thing. Her heavy chair loudly scraped the hard floor, and she aggressively grabbed her cheap purse entirely with violently trembling hands. "Wait!" he shockingly heard his own deep voice say. She completely stopped, her soft hand resting heavily entirely on the brass doorknob, her slender back completely to him. He vividly saw her small shoulders violently rise and fall completely, with a massive, incredibly deep breath. Exactly as if she were desperately, frantically gathering her absolute final strength. I genuinely hope you successfully find exactly what you are so aggressively looking for, she stated, with an incredibly quiet voice. Absolutely no toxic anger. Absolutely no bitter resentment. Just absolute, crushing sadness. Pure, unadulterated exhaustion. Then, she smoothly opened the heavy door and confidently walked out. Her soft footsteps beautifully, tragically fading completely down the long hallway. Logan stood perfectly frozen there, intensely staring directly at the empty, highly hollow doorframe. The heavy door slowly, automatically closed completely with a soft, final hiss. Absolute, terrifying finality. The elite lawyer, a highly thin, sharp man named Mr. Sterling, wearing thin-rimmed glasses and possessing a cold face that had witnessed way too incredibly many tragic endings, loudly cleared his dry throat. Mr. Vance, the massive legal paperwork will be officially, federally finalized in exactly a few short weeks. You will successfully receive— I completely know, Logan violently interrupted him. He absolutely did not want to hear the highly depressing, pathetic details. He absolutely did not want to actively think entirely about exactly what came next. He aggressively snatched his copies of the heavy papers and confidently walked out entirely into the crowded hallway. The massive courthouse was completely packed, entirely with busy people. Elite, arrogant lawyers in highly expensive suits. Shattered families desperately waiting their turn. Innocent children happily running completely between the heavy wooden benches. But Logan profoundly felt completely, utterly, terrifyingly disconnected entirely from absolutely all of it. He aggressively walked completely down the massive stairs. He desperately needed to physically move. He desperately needed the highly physical, downward act of aggressively descending to perfectly match exactly what he was violently feeling entirely on the inside. Outside, it had aggressively started to violently rain. Just a highly constant, depressing, freezing drizzle that actively made absolutely everything look incredibly gray and heavily faded. Logan confidently walked directly to his massive luxury car and sat heavily entirely behind the steering wheel, the highly official divorce papers resting heavily entirely on his lap. He had successfully done it. He was officially, completely free. Then exactly why the hell did he profoundly feel exactly as if he had literally just committed the absolute biggest, most catastrophic mistake of his entire life? His expensive phone violently vibrated. Miles Preston. Is it officially done? The arrogant voice was incredibly crisp, highly eager. Yes, Logan stated blankly. It is completely done. Excellent. That is incredible, massive news. Now you can finally, completely focus entirely on exactly what truly matters. Logan stared deeply at the thick divorce papers, at his massive, arrogant signature. The absolute, undeniable proof that he had violently, ruthlessly given up on the absolute only person who had ever genuinely, truly known him. Sure, he murmured. Listen closely. Tonight, we massively celebrate entirely at the luxury penthouse. Aggressively bring that intense focus completely with you. Leave the toxic past exactly where it rightfully belongs. It is officially time to aggressively move forward. Miles abruptly hung up. Logan sat completely frozen there, with the expensive phone still tightly clutched entirely in his hand, intensely watching the freezing rain violently slide completely down the heavy windshield. The absolute right decision. He had aggressively repeated that toxic lie completely to himself for agonizing months. He arrogantly believed he absolutely could not successfully build the massive future he fiercely wanted, entirely while heavily tied completely to a broken marriage that absolutely wasn't flawlessly working. That pure love absolutely wasn't nearly enough when absolutely everything else was violently crumbling. That aggressively walking completely away was the highly mature, strong thing to do. But exactly as he sat rigidly, entirely in his expensive car, intensely watching highly busy people frantically run completely through the freezing rain with heavy umbrellas and designer briefcases, he literally could not violently rip the haunting image of her trembling hand entirely out of his brilliant head. The exact, agonizing way she had violently struggled so incredibly hard to flawlessly keep herself completely together. The exact way she had beautifully, selflessly wished him the absolute best, even though he was the arrogant monster who was violently leaving. He aggressively started the massive engine and violently pulled completely out of the parking lot. He had absolutely zero idea exactly where the hell he was actively going, just completely away. Far, far away entirely from the massive courthouse, away from the highly toxic papers, entirely away from the massive choice he absolutely could not magically undo. The massive city aggressively stretched completely before him, freezing gray and utterly endless, and actively somewhere entirely within it, his beautiful wife, his ex-wife, was aggressively beginning an incredibly lonely, brand new life completely without him. Entirely because he had arrogantly asked her to. Entirely because he had toxically decided that she was violently holding him back. Entirely because he had been so incredibly, blindingly certain that he profoundly knew exactly what he wanted. The freezing rain aggressively continued to violently fall, and Logan aggressively continued to drive. Violently, leaving absolutely everything completely behind, while highly agonizingly carrying the massive, crushing weight of it all anyway. Interactive question. Logan chose his business over his wife. Do you think a career is ever worth sacrificing true love? Tell us your thoughts below. The invisible burden. Absolute, crushing loneliness. Absolutely does not highly dramatically announce itself. It moves in incredibly silently. Exactly one highly empty, agonizing hour entirely at a time. The highly pathetic apartment was significantly, suffocatingly smaller than she had ever expected. Exactly one tiny, cramped room featuring a highly depressing kitchenette shoved completely into the corner, and a tiny bathroom that could barely physically fit a cheap shower. The highly thin windows violently rattled completely whenever the freezing wind aggressively picked up. A highly constant, terrifying tremor that actively made the entire miserable place feel incredibly unstable. Sophia Reynolds gently set the absolute last, heavy cardboard box entirely on the floor, and looked completely around at her highly pathetic, brand new life. It absolutely did not look like much. The highly thin walls were completely bare, except entirely for a highly disgusting, dark, damp stain, completely in the corner that looked exactly like a highly twisted map of some terrifying place she had absolutely never been. The cheap carpet was heavily, violently worn, completely through in several spots. The previous highly careless tenant had rudely left a dying, pathetic plant completely on the windowsill. Something highly skinny with completely brown, dead leaves that she simply absolutely didn't have the shattered heart to violently throw away. She sat heavily, completely on the hard floor, her back pressed incredibly tightly, directly against the thin wall, and clearly heard the highly happy couple living directly next door. They were laughing loudly and entirely about something. She could perfectly, clearly hear them completely through the paper-thin walls. Their beautiful voices incredibly joyful and highly easy. Exactly the way hers used to be. Exactly the way hers and Logan's used to be, before he arrogantly decided that she absolutely wasn't enough. Before he aggressively sat her completely down and ruthlessly told her that he desperately needed to strictly focus entirely on himself. Entirely on his massive future. On aggressively building something that genuinely mattered. Before he made it highly, explicitly clear that she was the absolute anchor violently holding him down. She aggressively grabbed the cheap remote control and violently turned completely on the tiny television. A highly boring cooking show. Someone was aggressively making fresh pasta completely from scratch, highly enthusiastically talking entirely about the absolute importance of high-quality olive oil. She aggressively turned the high volume completely up until it successfully, violently drowned out the happy, mocking laughter directly next door. The agonizing days violently blended completely together entirely after that. She unpacked incredibly slowly, highly reluctantly, exactly as if actively putting her pathetic things securely on the cheap shelves would violently make this highly miserable place completely permanent. Exactly as if it explicitly meant she was truly, utterly, completely alone. Now, she carefully hung exactly 2 highly simple dresses entirely in the tiny closet. She placed her heavy books neatly completely on the windowsill. She stacked her few cheap plates completely in the tiny cabinet directly over the small sink. Absolutely everything flawlessly fit. That was the absolute most terrifying part. Her entire, massive life, perfectly fit, completely into this incredibly tiny, pathetic room entirely. Because Logan had aggressively, violently, taken absolutely everything else. The massive, luxury apartment they beautifully shared, the highly expensive furniture, the beautiful life they had meticulously built. He had violently left her with absolutely nothing but the pathetic scraps. At night, she lay completely awake and intensely stared directly at the cracked ceiling, intensely listening entirely to the highly strange sounds of the run-down building. Heavy, aggressive footsteps completely above, highly protesting, screaming pipes inside the walls. A highly lonely dog loudly barking entirely somewhere down the dark hall. She aggressively turned the tiny television back on, desperately allowing strange, highly random voices to completely fill the suffocating silence until she finally, exhaustedly, fell deeply asleep. But sleep brought absolutely zero peace. She would violently wake up completely in the absolute middle of the freezing night, highly disoriented. Instinctively, desperately reaching completely out for someone who absolutely wasn't there anymore. Someone who had made it incredibly, brutally clear that he absolutely did not want to be. The agonizing weeks violently passed, and her own body aggressively began to highly subtly, violently betray her entirely in highly small, terrifying ways. She woke up aggressively with blinding nausea, her highly upset stomach violently churning entirely for absolutely no logical reason. Normal food tasted incredibly strange. The highly strong smell of cheap coffee instantly made her violently gag. She was incredibly, profoundly exhausted, absolutely all the time. A highly deep, bone-crushing exhaustion that absolutely no massive amount of sleep could magically fix. She desperately told herself it was simply massive stress, that her traumatized body was highly aggressively processing the brutal divorce exactly as broken bodies normally do. That absolute, devastating heartbreak possessed a highly tangible, physical weight. The blinding nausea aggressively arrived in highly massive waves. She was perfectly fine exactly one moment, and the absolute next. She was frantically, violently, sprinting directly to the tiny bathroom. Her highly convulsing stomach violently heaving, even when there was absolutely nothing left to violently throw up. She aggressively began to highly cautiously leave cheap crackers directly by the bed, actively avoiding highly specific, strong smells, aggressively moving incredibly slowly and highly carefully, exactly as if one highly sudden, violent movement could instantaneously trigger another horrific episode. Her breasts violently ached completely, constantly, a highly severe tenderness that actively made wearing a normal bra incredibly uncomfortable. She frantically bought significantly softer ones, highly baggy, loose shirts. She desperately blamed it entirely on her highly irregular cycle, completely destroyed by massive toxic stress. One freezing morning, she stood completely frozen, entirely under the cheap shower until the hot water completely ran freezing cold. Her soft hands pressed incredibly tightly directly against the cheap tiles, her head heavily bowed, the freezing water aggressively running completely down her shoulders. She stood perfectly there, violently trembling until her pale skin turned bright, freezing pink, and her fingers completely wrinkled. When she finally, aggressively turned the freezing water completely off, she clearly saw herself entirely in the cracked mirror. Her beautiful face looked significantly thinner, her beautiful eyes incredibly exhausted. But there was something completely else, a highly subtle, undeniable softness completely in her body that absolutely had not been there before. A highly tender, subtle fullness that she literally could not magically explain or logically name. She pressed her soft hand directly against her chest and violently shivered. Then, significantly lower, directly onto her flat stomach. Absolutely nothing. Just soft skin, thin muscle, and the highly hollow, crushing sensation of absolute emptiness. But the terrifying sensation violently persisted. That highly strange, terrifying awareness. A massive consciousness of her own body that felt incredibly, highly alien. She quickly dressed and confidently went entirely to work. She had desperately found a highly pathetic minimum wage job, aggressively answering phones entirely in a tiny, crowded law office. It was highly temporary, incredibly simple. The exact type of highly mindless work that absolutely did not require her to actively think, or fiercely feel, or be absolutely anything more than a highly polite, robotic voice, entirely on the line. The tiny office was incredibly small and highly crowded, completely stuffed entirely with heavy filing cabinets and aggressively smelling entirely of highly burnt cheap coffee. Her cheap desk directly faced a highly blank gray wall. She fiercely liked it exactly like that. "Good morning, Harmony Associates. Exactly how may I flawlessly direct your highly important call?" The polite words violently became a highly robotic mantra, a highly defensive script to cowardly hide completely behind. She aggressively repeated them over and over and over, flawlessly transferring massive calls, taking highly detailed messages, entirely existing completely in the highly empty spaces, completely between absolutely everyone else's massive problems. The highly quiet office was incredibly silent, the absolute majority of the long days. Just her, and exactly 2 highly busy lawyers, who aggressively spent the absolute vast majority of their time completely behind heavy, closed doors. She sat rigidly at her cheap desk, rapidly answering the heavy phone exactly when it violently rang, staring blankly directly at the gray wall exactly when it didn't. The blank wall was highly reliable, completely graceless. Absolutely safe. Sometimes, she shockingly caught herself gently, protectively touching her flat stomach completely without even actively realizing it. Exactly one soft hand resting highly securely there. Incredibly protective. Highly conscious. She would violently, rapidly yank it completely away. Exactly as if she had literally just been brutally caught aggressively doing something incredibly wrong. During her highly lonely lunch hour, she walked slowly directly to the local park and sat heavily entirely on a wooden bench. She brought a highly cheap sandwich and absolutely did not eat a single bite of it. She simply sat there, intensely watching normal people happily living their beautiful lives. Energetic runners with loud headphones, happy mothers with expensive strollers, beautiful couples holding hands. Absolutely everyone highly seemed to profoundly know exactly where they were actively going. She intensely, obsessively watched the happy mothers. The exact, flawless way they smoothly pushed the expensive strollers entirely, with highly practiced, effortless ease. Exactly how they gently wiped tiny noses, meticulously adjusted warm blankets, and confidently moved completely through the massive world entirely. With a highly profound purpose that she literally could not even begin to comprehend. She intensely watched, and she physically felt something massive violently twist completely in her chest. Massive longing, crushing loss, something completely, terrifyingly nameless. And then, one highly fateful afternoon, she vividly saw him, Logan. He was confidently walking entirely on the complete other side of the busy street, effortlessly carrying expensive grocery bags, happily walking directly alongside someone. A highly tall, handsome man, completely wearing a highly expensive designer coat, who was aggressively, happily gesturing widely exactly as he spoke. They were loudly laughing. Genuinely, truly laughing. Logan's handsome head was completely thrown heavily back. His incredibly broad shoulders completely, flawlessly relaxed entirely in a highly beautiful way that she absolutely hadn't seen in agonizing years. He looked incredibly, beautifully lighter, completely unburdened, exactly as if ruthlessly divorcing her had miraculously, beautifully freed him completely from something incredibly heavy. Her ragged breath completely caught in her dry throat. She violently stood up, aggressively dropping her untouched sandwich directly onto the dirty ground. She frantically, desperately hid completely behind a highly parked, massive SUV, violently crouching completely down, her massive heart violently, aggressively hammering entirely against her ribs. She intensely watched them completely through the tinted windows of the car. She clearly saw Logan nod happily completely at something the other man said. She vividly saw his massive, brilliant smile. The exact same beautiful smile he arrogantly used to warmly give her completely before he toxically decided that she was absolutely no longer worth the massive effort. They smoothly turned the busy corner and completely, permanently, disappeared. She remained completely frozen, entirely behind the massive car for several agonizing minutes, her soft hand violently pressed directly against her heavy chest, desperately attempting to violently calm completely down, desperately trying to miraculously remember exactly how to normally breathe. That exact night, she stood completely frozen entirely in the tiny bathroom, intensely staring directly at her pale reflection. The blinding nausea had aggressively, violently worsened. The massive exhaustion was completely, undeniably, constant now. And there was something completely else. A highly massive, undeniable sensation she literally could not logically name. A massive presence entirely within her own body that physically felt incredibly alien and highly, beautifully familiar entirely at the exact same time. She violently pressed absolutely both hands entirely against her stomach. She physically felt the highly subtle, undeniable bulge she had been aggressively, cowardly ignoring. The highly subtle, unmistakable roundness that absolutely did not perfectly match the massive weight loss entirely in the absolute rest of her thin body. "It is absolutely just massive stress," she whispered highly desperately entirely to the cracked mirror. "Just massive, crushing grief." But even exactly as she verbally said it, she profoundly knew it was an absolute, massive lie. Her traumatized body profoundly knew the absolute truth long before her highly terrified mind did. It had been aggressively, desperately attempting to explicitly tell her for agonizing weeks. The highly massive, undeniable signs were absolutely all right there. She had simply been way too incredibly, blindingly terrified to clearly see them. She crawled heavily directly into her cheap bed and aggressively turned completely on the tiny television. A highly boring, late-night talk show. Someone was aggressively telling highly stupid jokes that absolutely didn't seem remotely funny entirely to her. She aggressively turned the volume completely up and violently pulled the thin blanket entirely over her head. In the highly thin apartment directly next door, the happy couple was laughing loudly again. Absolutely always. Happily laughing. The joyful sound violently filtered completely through the thin walls, exactly like a highly toxic, cruel reminder entirely of absolutely everything she had violently lost. And she lay completely frozen there, entirely in the pitch-black darkness. With exactly one soft hand resting highly protectively, completely over her stomach. Physically feeling something massive, beautifully move completely inside her that she absolutely wasn't completely ready to officially name. Something massive that would completely, violently change absolutely everything. A beautiful life. Perhaps exactly two. Miraculously growing entirely inside her, while Logan arrogantly, happily moved completely on entirely, with his highly unburdened, massive new existence. Only, she absolutely didn't fully know it just yet. Interactive question. Sophia is struggling alone while Logan lives his best life. Have you ever felt completely abandoned during a hard time? Share your thoughts below. The collapse and the revelation. Some massive, terrifying truths violently arrive way too incredibly late to magically change the highly toxic past. But exactly, perfectly on time to completely, catastrophically shatter the entire future. The highly freezing morning aggressively began exactly like absolutely all the others. She violently woke up completely to the highly obnoxious alarm entirely on her cheap phone. The blinding, horrific nausea absolutely already aggressively waiting entirely for her, exactly like a highly unwelcome, toxic guest. She moved incredibly slowly completely through her highly robotic routine. Scalding shower, getting dressed, preparing cheap coffee that she absolutely wouldn't even drink. The tiny apartment was completely, utterly silent, entirely except for the highly rhythmic sound of running water and her own highly shallow breathing. The highly crowded bus stop was exactly 3 massive blocks completely away. She walked incredibly slowly, with her heavy head bowed completely down, intensely watching her cheap shoes aggressively move exactly one right after the other. The dirty sidewalk was heavily cracked entirely in highly numerous places. Completely with all the massive cracks, she actively concentrated entirely on the highly rhythmic pace of walking. Absolutely anything to aggressively prevent her highly terrified mind from violently wandering entirely to highly forbidden, dark places. The entire massive world violently tilted completely without a single microscopic warning. One exact microsecond, she was standing perfectly still, highly exhaustedly waiting entirely for the massive bus, completely with a small handful of other tired commuters. The absolute next. The hard concrete sidewalk was violently, aggressively rushing completely toward her face. She physically felt her weak knees violently give completely out. She physically felt the freezing rough pavement aggressively scrape her soft palms. She clearly heard someone violently scream. She physically felt strangers' hands aggressively grabbing her thin arms. And then, absolutely nothing. She violently woke up completely to blinding, massive brightness. Highly aggressive, fluorescent lights violently burning directly into her exhausted eyes. Pristine white walls. A sterile white ceiling. The highly aggressive toxic chemical smell of heavy disinfectant and something completely else. Something highly antiseptic and freezing cold that violently made her weak stomach completely churn. You are officially awake. Excellent. Please stay completely, perfectly still. A highly professional elite nurse magically appeared directly over her, incredibly young and highly efficient, meticulously checking something highly complex entirely on a glowing medical monitor. The highly rhythmic beeping was incredibly loud. Way too incredibly loud. Every single massive beep physically seemed to aggressively occur entirely inside her own skull. What exactly happened? Her voice violently came out incredibly hoarse, exactly like rough sandpaper aggressively scraping entirely against hard wood. You violently fainted completely at the crowded bus stop. Someone urgently called emergency services. You have been completely unconscious for quite a while. Do you vividly remember aggressively hitting your head? She desperately tried to completely remember. The freezing sidewalk. The highly violent impact. The strange hands that frantically held her. I absolutely do not know. I genuinely think not. We are actively going to aggressively run some highly advanced tests. Absolute standard procedure. The elite doctor will absolutely be here incredibly soon. Nurse Lawson rapidly left, and she was completely, utterly alone, entirely, with the highly aggressive, beeping machines and the blinding, toxic, bright lights. She tightly closed her beautiful eyes and desperately attempted to aggressively slow her rapid breathing. She desperately tried to logically think. She had been incredibly exhausted. Yes, highly nauseous, but violently fainting? That was completely terrifyingly brand new. That was highly catastrophically wrong. That was, hello. She violently snapped her eyes open. A highly professional young doctor stood confidently directly at the absolute foot of her bed, with a highly advanced medical tablet securely in his hand. He possessed incredibly kind eyes and highly exhausted shoulders. The exact tired look of someone who had violently seen way too incredibly and horrific emergencies. His elite badge proudly read, Dr. Harrison. I am officially Dr. Harrison. Exactly how are you physically feeling? Incredibly confused, mostly highly embarrassed. There is absolutely zero need to be embarrassed. Violently fainting is simply your highly intelligent body explicitly telling you that something massive is highly wrong. We are aggressively going to find out exactly what it is. He smoothly stepped completely to the side of the massive bed and gently set the heavy tablet down. Can you explicitly, highly detailedly, tell me completely about your massive symptoms? Exactly how incredibly long have you actively been feeling unwell? She deeply thought. She desperately attempted to remember exactly when it brutally started. A few agonizing weeks, perhaps significantly more, I have been completely exhausted, highly nauseous. I genuinely, foolishly thought it was simply massive stress. Is there absolutely any highly possible chance that you are currently, actively pregnant? The massive, terrifying question violently floated completely in the heavy air, exactly like highly toxic smoke. Incredibly heavy, violently suffocating. No, she stated highly automatically. Then she completely, violently stopped. She rapidly, frantically, counted completely backward entirely in her brilliant mind. The brutal divorce had been exactly this long ago. The absolute, very last time she and Logan had been intimately together was completely before that. Before he aggressively told her he desperately wanted out. Before he made it brutally clear that their beautiful marriage was completely, permanently over. Before, I absolutely do not know, she stated incredibly quietly. Dr. Harrison nodded slowly, exactly as if that was the absolute, exact answer he heavily expected. Exactly as if he had clearly heard that exact same, highly terrified uncertainty exactly 1,000 times before. We are aggressively going to find completely out. I am actively going to immediately perform a highly advanced ultrasound, entirely just to be 100% absolutely sure. He smoothly rolled a massive high-tech machine directly over. He gently helped her aggressively adjust the massive bed. He carefully lifted her thin shirt. The highly specialized medical gel was freezing cold entirely on her pale skin. She violently shivered, thick goosebumps aggressively erupting completely on her thin arms. I am incredibly sorry. This will actively take just exactly 1 short minute. He gently pressed the heavy transducer completely against her soft abdomen, moving it incredibly slowly. Intensely, watching the glowing screen completely with highly focused, razor-sharp attention. She aggressively looked completely away. She absolutely did not want to see. She absolutely did not want to horrifyingly know if she was heavily pregnant entirely with Logan's biological child, while he happily celebrated his toxic freedom, while he laughed joyfully completely with arrogant strangers entirely on the street. Oh, Dr. Harrison stated incredibly softly. She violently looked directly at him. His highly professional expression had completely, radically changed. Massive surprise, pure wonder, something massive that completely, violently stopped her massive heart. "What?" she whispered, highly terrified. He smoothly turned the glowing monitor directly toward her. The dark screen was completely black, entirely except for exactly 2 highly distinct, tiny shapes violently pulsing completely in the static. Exactly 2 massive rhythms. Exactly 2 tiny, beautiful heartbeats. Parallelly blinking, exactly like incredibly distant, bright stars entirely in a pitch-black sky. "Twins," Dr. Harrison stated with absolute pure gentleness. "You are officially, heavily pregnant, entirely, with identical twins." The entire, massive world completely, violently, stopped actively spinning. Or perhaps it aggressively began to actively spin way too incredibly fast. She literally could not physically tell the massive difference. She intensely stared directly at the glowing screen, the exactly 2 incredibly tiny, perfect pulses. And something massive violently shattered completely inside her heavy chest. Something massive that had been heavily held completely together absolutely only by pure, unadulterated willpower. "That is absolutely medically impossible," she heard her own highly shaky voice state. "It is incredibly, highly possible. Entirely by the massive size, I accurately estimate that you are exactly 12 weeks along. Perhaps significantly more. Have you actively had your normal cycle highly recently?" She desperately tried to think. actively remembering absolutely anything from the last highly agonizing months was an absolute blurry blur. The brutal divorce, the highly depressing move, Logan ruthlessly telling her he desperately needed to aggressively move completely on. The completely endless, highly agonizing days, desperately attempting to flawlessly keep herself entirely together. Desperately trying to simply survive. She literally could not actively remember. She absolutely couldn't. "I urgently need you to actively breathe," Dr. Harrison stated, his massive hand resting gently entirely on her soft shoulder. Incredibly gentle, firmly anchoring her. Massive, deep breaths, completely in and completely out. She was violently crying. When the hell had she aggressively started crying? Hot, heavy tears were violently streaming entirely down her pale face, incredibly hot and utterly unstoppable, and she literally could not magically stop them. She violently pressed exactly one trembling hand completely against her soft mouth, then aggressively against her stomach, physically feeling the highly subtle, undeniable bulge that she had cowardly blamed entirely on massive stress, entirely on eating highly cheap, unhealthy fast food, and actively failing to flawlessly take care of herself. "Twins," she whispered brokenly. "Yes, and from exactly what I can clearly see, they are incredibly, miraculously healthy. Highly strong heartbeats. Flawless, perfect position. But you are highly, severely dehydrated, and your critical iron levels are incredibly, dangerously low. That is exactly why you violently fainted. You desperately need to actively take significantly better care of yourself. These beautiful babies absolutely need you. These beautiful babies. Logan's biological babies, miraculously growing entirely inside her, entirely, while he arrogantly moved completely on, while he happily started completely anew, while she heavily carried them completely, utterly alone, completely without knowing, completely without fully understanding exactly why her traumatized body was violently changing. "Does absolutely anyone know?" Dr. Harrison asked incredibly carefully, his deep voice incredibly soft. "The biological father?" She violently shook her head. The hot tears aggressively continued to violently fall, flawlessly tracing deep, highly agonizing paths entirely down her pale cheeks and completely soaking the cheap hospital gown. "No, he absolutely does not know. We are completely, legally divorced. He violently left me. Her voice violently cracked. "He completely walked away." Dr. Harrison smoothly pulled the cheap plastic chair completely closer and sat heavily entirely beside her bed. He said absolutely nothing for a highly massive long moment. He simply, beautifully allowed her to violently cry. He generously let her aggressively process. He flawlessly let her fiercely feel exactly what she desperately needed to actively feel. When she finally, exhaustedly looked directly at him, his highly professional expression was incredibly kind, highly understanding. "Exactly what you actively do completely next is your absolute own choice," he stated firmly. "But these beautiful babies are incredibly real. They are absolutely here, and they are actively going to desperately need you to be incredibly strong, significantly stronger than you have absolutely ever been." She looked deeply back entirely at the glowing screen. The exactly two tiny, perfect pulses absolutely still beautifully blinking. Exactly two beautiful lives that absolutely had not desperately asked to be magically created. Exactly two innocent children who would actively arrive entirely into a highly massive world, exactly where their arrogant father had violently left completely before they even miraculously existed. "Can I please just actively have exactly 1 single minute?" she asked, her voice barely a highly fragile whisper. "Absolutely, of course. Aggressively take absolutely all the massive time you desperately need. The elite nurse will actively return incredibly soon to thoroughly check completely on you." He quietly left, aggressively taking the massive ultrasound machine entirely with him. But the highly beautiful, terrifying image remained permanently, violently, burned entirely into her brilliant mind. Exactly 2 tiny heartbeats. Exactly 2 tiny, beautiful futures completely, 100%, depending entirely on her. Exactly 2 massive reasons why absolutely everything had literally just aggressively become impossibly, terrifyingly complicated. She violently pressed absolutely both hands entirely against her stomach, physically feeling the highly subtle, beautiful curve directly under her soft palms, physically feeling the massive, crushing weight of exactly what was beautifully growing right there, physically feeling the massive, terrifying responsibility aggressively settle completely over her, exactly like a highly heavy, suffocating blanket. "I will aggressively do it completely alone," she fiercely whispered directly to the tiny babies, who absolutely could not hear her yet. To the innocent children, who would absolutely never, ever know that their arrogant father had violently chosen to permanently leave. To the beautiful lives she would aggressively, violently protect absolutely, no matter the massive, agonizing cost. "I fiercely promise you both, I will fiercely keep you completely safe. I will absolutely do it completely alone." Logan had desperately, arrogantly wanted absolute freedom. He had desperately wanted to aggressively build his massive future completely without her in it. Well, he absolutely already had it. And she magically had this. Exactly 2 beautiful lives miraculously growing entirely inside her that he would absolutely never, ever know about. Because he had aggressively made his toxic choice, and now she was fiercely making hers. Outside the massive window, the heavy clouds aggressively moved completely across the sky. Normal people happily went entirely about their daily lives, completely oblivious to the massive, tiny miracle and highly agonizing tragedy actively occurring entirely in that highly sterile room. The massive world aggressively kept spinning. Completely indifferent entirely to massive personal catastrophes, and completely inside her, exactly 2 tiny hearts beautifully beat, unaware, unbreakable, alive. She tightly closed her eyes and fiercely made herself a massive, unbreakable promise that she literally had absolutely no idea exactly how to successfully keep. A massive promise that would entirely define absolutely everything that violently came next. She would brilliantly survive this. She would fiercely keep them completely safe, even if it explicitly meant heavily carrying the massive, crushing weight of this toxic secret completely until it violently crushed her. Even if it explicitly meant that Logan would absolutely never, ever know exactly what he had violently, permanently left behind. Interactive question. Sophia decided to keep the twins a secret. Do you think she should have called Logan immediately? What would you have done? Let us know below. The isolation and the emergency. You can easily run completely away from a highly toxic person, but you absolutely cannot magically run completely away entirely from the massive life you once beautifully shared. The exact very next day, she aggressively quit her highly pathetic job. The elite office manager, a highly serious woman named Patricia Gomez, who constantly wore thin reading glasses entirely on a long chain, was completely, utterly shocked when Sophia confidently walked directly in, completely with her formal resignation letter heavily folded entirely in her purse. "Is absolutely everything okay?" Patricia asked. Pure, unadulterated concern, beautifully softening her usually highly severe, strict expression. "Highly urgent family matters," she stated smoothly. It absolutely wasn't completely a massive lie. Brand new, highly urgent family matters were miraculously growing entirely inside her, completely with every single passing second. "I desperately need to aggressively focus entirely on some highly personal, massive things." Patricia absolutely did not aggressively press her. She simply nodded fiercely, flawlessly processed the massive paperwork entirely with quiet, absolute efficiency, and beautifully wished her the absolute best. By exactly lunch hour, her cheap desk was completely, utterly empty. She confidently walked out entirely with exactly one single cardboard box, completely filled entirely with her few pathetic belongings. A cheap coffee mug, an old sweater, a highly pathetic plant she had absolutely never watered properly. And she absolutely never, ever looked completely back. She frantically found highly remote work, aggressively answering heavy phones entirely from her tiny apartment, mostly entirely for elite medical offices, meticulously coordinating massive appointments, accurately taking highly detailed messages. The pathetic pay was significantly lower, but it was incredibly, highly flexible. She could easily, comfortably work entirely in her cheap pajamas, aggressively take massive breaks exactly when the blinding nausea was incredibly brutal, entirely exist completely in the highly tiny, incredibly safe little world entirely of her small apartment, completely without ever actively facing the massive, terrifying outside. But the massive, terrifying outside world actively possessed highly cruel ways of violently finding her absolutely anyway. She aggressively began to visually show significantly sooner than she had ever expected. The highly subtle tiny bump violently became completely, utterly undeniable. Entirely impossible to flawlessly hide completely under highly baggy, loose clothes. She frantically bought highly cheap maternity clothes completely from a local thrift store. Incredibly soft, highly forgiving fabrics that comfortably stretched completely over her rapidly growing belly. Highly used clothes that faintly, strangely, smelled entirely of someone else's past life, of someone else's massive pregnancy, of someone else's pure, unadulterated joy. She moved significantly more slowly. She spoke significantly less. She actively learned exactly how to flawlessly navigate the massive world, exactly like someone heavily carrying a highly toxic, massive secret that aggressively grew incredibly heavier every single day. Every single morning she violently woke up, and the massive secret was significantly bigger, massively more present, utterly, completely impossible to ever ignore. Every single highly random sound violently became Logan. Every single heavy footstep. Every single deep voice. Every single heavy car door violently slamming completely shut, entirely on the dark street far below. She would be quietly washing cheap dishes and clearly hear loud laughter completely outside, and her entire massive body would violently, aggressively tense up, intensely listening for a highly specific, deep voice she would intimately recognize absolutely anywhere, for the highly particular, rhythmic cadence of his deep laugh, the exact, unique way he heavily emphasized highly specific words, the exact, beautiful sound that used to effortlessly make her smile, and now violently made her desperately want to completely cowardly hide. She would be actively in the local grocery store, desperately reaching for cheap milk, and vividly see someone wearing a highly expensive blue jacket, the exact, precise color Logan absolutely always wore, and her massive heart would completely, violently stop. Until they slowly turned completely around and clearly revealed the entirely unfamiliar face of a complete stranger. A highly different face that looked absolutely nothing like his. But for exactly one terrifying, horrific microsecond, it had violently been him. The massive city was entirely filled completely with highly terrifying ghosts. Massive, loud echoes, entirely of a beautiful life she had been violently forced to permanently leave completely behind. Every single busy corner held a highly agonizing memory. Every single luxury restaurant, the painful ghost of a beautiful date. Every single wooden park bench, an exact specific spot where they had sat beautifully together and happily talked entirely about a massive future that would absolutely never, ever arrive. A massive future that Logan had toxically decided he absolutely did not fiercely want entirely with her. One highly beautiful late spring afternoon, she desperately needed fresh air. The thin, pathetic walls of the tiny apartment were violently closing completely and entirely on her. And the tiny babies, she had actively begun to beautifully think of them entirely as the babies, absolutely not as it or they, were incredibly, highly active, aggressively moving completely inside her, entirely in highly strange ways that physically felt exactly like tiny, beautiful miracles and highly terrifying, massive burdens entirely at the exact same time. She slowly walked directly to the local park. The exact same beautiful park, exactly where she used to quietly eat completely during her depressing office days. The wooden benches were completely full. Happy families absolutely everywhere. Energetic children happily playing entirely on the massive swings, their pure laughter beautifully cutting entirely through the crisp air. Happy dogs enthusiastically chasing dirty tennis balls. Beautiful couples walking entirely hand in hand, completely, blissfully, lost entirely in their own massive worlds. She quietly found a highly shaded spot, directly under a massive tree, and sat heavily down. Exactly one soft hand, resting highly protectively, entirely on her massive stomach. The rough bark was incredibly rough, completely against her back. The cool shade was incredibly refreshing. The massive world felt almost completely, beautifully at peace. The tiny babies aggressively gave a tiny, beautiful kick, then another, exactly as if happily saying a tiny hello. Exactly as if they profoundly knew that she desperately needed the massive, beautiful reminder that they were absolutely there, that they were incredibly real, that she absolutely wasn't magically imagining absolutely all of it. "You are both incredibly active today," she whispered incredibly softly. A fast runner quickly passed by, then another. The warm sun beautifully heated her pale face. She tightly closed her beautiful eyes, generously permitting herself to blissfully pretend entirely for just exactly one single, fleeting moment that absolutely everything was perfectly fine. That she was absolutely just another normal, heavily pregnant woman, happily enjoying a beautiful spring day. That Logan had absolutely not violently abandoned her completely before he even miraculously knew about them. When she slowly opened her beautiful eyes, she vividly, horrifyingly saw them directly on the absolute other side of the busy street. Directly outside a highly expensive luxury cafe, entirely with outdoor seating and highly colorful, bright umbrellas. Logan. And the exact same, highly arrogant man from completely before. The tall one, wearing the highly expensive designer coat, confidently walking perfectly side by side, effortlessly carrying highly expensive grocery bags, laughing incredibly loudly, entirely about something highly amusing. Her heavy breath violently caught completely in her chest, exactly like a highly terrified, trapped bird. Logan looked incredibly good, highly healthy. His dark hair was styled significantly shorter than she intimately remembered. He dressed impeccably entirely in highly expensive, designer clothes that she absolutely did not recognize. Aggressively moving completely through the massive world, exactly like someone who had successfully, flawlessly found his absolute balance again. Someone who had violently dropped highly massive, dead weight entirely behind and felt infinitely, miraculously lighter, completely for it. Someone who had ruthlessly moved completely on and successfully found something infinitely better entirely on the absolute other side. She violently stood up incredibly fast, completely out of pure, primal instinct, her massive heart violently, aggressively hammering entirely against her ribs. She desperately needed to completely hide. She desperately needed to violently disappear. She desperately needed to magically become entirely invisible. She frantically moved completely behind a highly parked massive car, violently crouching completely down entirely despite her massive, heavy belly, entirely despite the highly painful discomfort, entirely despite absolutely everything. Directly through the tinted windows of the massive car, she vividly saw Logan confidently say something highly amusing that actively made the other man violently throw his head completely back in loud laughter. She vividly saw exactly how he effortlessly adjusted the heavy bags entirely in his massive arms. She clearly saw exactly how he confidently moved completely through the massive world, exactly like someone who had violently left the highly toxic past completely behind and absolutely did not regret a single microscopic second of it. Exactly like someone who was completely, utterly free. They completely stopped directly at the busy crosswalk. Her massive heart was violently beating so incredibly hard that she genuinely, truly thought she might actually, violently faint completely again. If they aggressively crossed, if they confidently came directly into the park, if he vividly saw her exactly like this, heavily pregnant and pathetically hiding completely behind a dirty car, but they smoothly turned entirely the absolute other way, confidently walked completely down the busy street, flawlessly disappeared entirely around the corner, completely taking Logan's highly familiar, beautiful laugh entirely with them. She remained completely frozen, entirely behind the massive car for several agonizing minutes, with exactly one soft hand violently pressed directly against her heavy chest, desperately trying to violently calm completely down, desperately trying to miraculously remember exactly how to normally breathe. The tiny babies violently kicked again, significantly harder this time, almost exactly as if they physically, deeply sensed her massive, blinding anguish. She violently pressed her other soft hand completely against her massive stomach. "It is perfectly fine," she whispered incredibly softly. "We are absolutely fine." But they absolutely were not fine. Absolutely nothing was fine. She had literally just vividly seen the exact man who had violently abandoned her. looking significantly, infinitely happier than he had entirely in agonizing years. Entirely, while she pathetically hid completely behind a dirty car, heavily carrying his biological children that he absolutely didn't even know miraculously existed. Children he had absolutely never, ever wanted completely in the absolute first place. Children who would have been absolutely nothing more than just another massive, toxic burden violently holding him entirely back. She walked incredibly slowly, completely back home, her weak legs violently trembling entirely from blinding adrenaline and pure, unadulterated exhaustion. She deliberately took the incredibly long way entirely back, aggressively avoiding highly busy main streets, keeping her beautiful head heavily bowed completely down. By the exact time she successfully reached the highly depressing apartment, her swollen feet violently ached and her lower back aggressively burned. Entirely with that highly particular, excruciating pain that exclusively comes completely from heavily carrying massive, extra weight. She agonizingly climbed the steep stairs. The cheap elevator had been completely broken for agonizing weeks, and securely locked herself completely inside. That exact night, she stood completely frozen, entirely, in front of the highly cracked bathroom mirror, intensely staring directly at her pale reflection. Her massive belly was completely, utterly undeniable now. Perfectly round and incredibly firm. The tiny babies were incredibly real, rapidly growing, aggressively taking up significantly more space every single day, actively making their massive presence profoundly known entirely in highly undeniable ways that absolutely could not be completely ignored. She slowly lifted her cheap shirt, gently running her soft hand completely over the highly stretched skin. Sometimes she could clearly, visually see the massive movement. A tiny, perfect foot, aggressively pressing entirely from the inside. A tiny elbow, some incredibly small, perfect part, entirely of them, aggressively announcing its pure presence, beautifully reminding her that she absolutely wasn't completely alone, even though she profoundly felt significantly more incredibly alone than ever before. Your arrogant father absolutely does not completely know entirely about you, she whispered incredibly softly, directly to the cracked reflection. And he is absolutely never, ever going to know. He violently left us. He arrogantly chose to completely leave, and we are actively going to be perfectly fine, completely without him. Just us. Just exactly the three of us. Her beautiful voice violently cracked completely on the absolute last word. The massive, highly toxic lie had completely turned incredibly bitter entirely in her dry mouth. Because they absolutely were not perfectly fine. Because she was absolutely, blindingly terrified. Because every single agonizing day, she violently woke up desperately wondering exactly how she was actually going to aggressively do this completely alone. Exactly how she was going to fiercely raise exactly 2 tiny children completely without any help, without massive support, entirely without the exact man who absolutely should have been right there, but arrogantly chose absolutely not to be. She slowly lowered her cheap shirt and completely stepped entirely away from the mirror. She crawled heavily directly into her cheap bed, aggressively turned completely on the tiny television. A highly boring, late-night nature documentary, something entirely about massive whales and highly complex migration, and the incredibly long, highly arduous journeys they aggressively made entirely across massive oceans. She aggressively turned the volume completely up and tightly closed her beautiful eyes. But deep sleep absolutely did not smoothly come. She lay completely frozen there, entirely, with exactly one soft hand completely on her massive belly, physically feeling the tiny babies beautifully move, physically feeling the massive, crushing weight entirely of absolutely everything that Logan absolutely did not know, entirely of absolutely everything he had violently left completely behind, entirely before it even miraculously existed. The happy couple directly next door was loudly laughing again. Absolutely always laughing. She agonizingly wondered exactly what it would truly feel like to be so incredibly, blissfully carefree. To happily live a beautiful life, completely without the massive, crushing weight of highly toxic secrets and massive, brutal regrets. And the highly agonizing, terrifying knowledge that someone you had fiercely loved had arrogantly decided that you absolutely weren't worth fiercely fighting for. The tiny babies aggressively kicked. "I completely know," she whispered incredibly softly entirely to him. I absolutely know." Outside, the massive city aggressively buzzed entirely with pure life. Cars and highly busy people and bright lights. Distant, wailing sirens. The massive world aggressively spinning completely without her. Utterly, completely indifferent entirely to her massive struggles. And she lay completely frozen there, entirely in the dark. Heavily carrying exactly two beautiful futures entirely inside her, desperately wondering exactly how she was going to fiercely do this completely alone. Agonizingly wondering if Logan absolutely ever thought entirely about her. Frantically wondering if he genuinely felt even exactly one single, fleeting moment of pure, unadulterated regret. The tiny television continuously babbled entirely about highly complex whale songs and incredibly deep ocean trenches. The tiny babies finally, peacefully settled completely down, and she finally, exhaustedly, slipped entirely into a highly restless, fitful sleep. Beautifully dreaming entirely about massive oceans and violently drowning. And highly distant voices urgently calling entirely to her, completely from very far away. Deep voices that sounded exactly, terrifyingly like Logan. Urgently calling her completely back, desperately telling her that he had been completely, catastrophically wrong. But they were absolutely just pathetic dreams. And exactly when she violently woke up, she was absolutely still, completely, utterly alone. Interactive question. Sophia is struggling with her pregnancy alone while keeping it a secret. What do you think is the hardest part of being a single parent? Tell us your thoughts below. The brutal toll. The traumatized body aggressively keeps the highly exact score, and exactly when the absolute time finally comes to violently pay the massive debt, it absolutely arrives entirely all at once. The elite doctor's office was securely located entirely in a highly sterile medical building that aggressively smelled entirely of strong cleaning products and pure, unadulterated worry. She sat heavily, entirely, in the crowded waiting room, frantically filling out highly complex medical forms, perfectly attached entirely to a cheap clipboard. Meticulously checking tiny boxes entirely about her medical history and complex family conditions. When the official form highly intrusively asked entirely for the biological father's detailed information, she aggressively left it completely blank. Dr. Evans was a highly serious, incredibly stern woman, entirely with silver hair, flawlessly pulled completely back entirely into a tight bun, and highly piercing eyes that absolutely missed nothing. She meticulously reviewed the highly complex forms, intensely looked entirely at the official hospital ultrasound images, and frowned incredibly deeply. "You are highly, severely anemic," she stated incredibly strictly. "Your highly critical iron levels are incredibly, dangerously low, and your high blood pressure is highly, extremely concerning." "I am aggressively taking expensive vitamins," she stated defensively. "It is absolutely not nearly enough. You desperately need highly potent iron supplements, and you desperately need massive support, someone actively securely with you. These are highly dangerous, high-risk pregnancies. Twins, dangerously low iron, massive indicators of highly toxic stress, completely all over your medical file. Do you actively possess close family? Loyal friends? The biological father?" She violently flinched completely at the absolute last word. "I am perfectly fine. I can flawlessly handle it." Dr. Evans heavily put the thick file completely down and looked directly, intensely at her. "Can you genuinely?" The massive, terrifying question violently hung completely in the heavy air entirely between them. Incredibly heavy. Highly accusatory. "Yes," she stated, but her beautiful voice violently trembled. "I am absolutely not actively trying to toxically judge you. I am desperately trying to miraculously keep you and these beautiful babies completely alive. Right this exact moment, you are absolutely failing to do so. You barely eat. You absolutely do not sleep. Your fragile body is completely, violently falling apart. If you absolutely do not rapidly make massive changes, there will absolutely be highly catastrophic, lethal consequences." She nodded fiercely, aggressively took the expensive prescriptions, and fiercely promised to flawlessly do significantly better. But aggressively doing better was infinitely, massively harder than simply pathetically promising it. The highly potent iron supplements instantly made her violently nauseous. She aggressively took them and violently spent an entire agonizing hour entirely in the tiny bathroom, aggressively vomiting completely into the cheap toilet. Normal food tasted incredibly foul. Absolutely everything aggressively smelled way too incredibly strong. She was rapidly, dangerously losing massive weight entirely instead of actively gaining it. She desperately tried to flawlessly follow Dr. Evans' highly strict instructions. She genuinely, truly tried. She frantically bought highly expensive groceries that simply sat entirely untouched, completely in the cheap refrigerator. She aggressively set loud alarms entirely on her phone, just to urgently remind herself to actively eat. She violently forced herself to aggressively drink highly thick protein shakes that tasted exactly like highly toxic chalk, and violently made her highly sensitive stomach completely rebel. Absolutely nothing stayed completely down. Absolutely nothing felt perfectly right. The agonizing nights violently became utterly, completely unbearable. She lay completely awake entirely with her lower back violently aching, her thin legs painfully cramping, the growing babies aggressively pressing completely against her fragile bladder every single agonizing hour. She would exhaustedly get completely up, slowly walk entirely to the tiny bathroom, heavily lie completely back down, exhaustedly get completely up again. The highly brutal cycle violently repeated completely until the absolute break of dawn, exactly when pure, unadulterated exhaustion finally, violently dragged her completely under. Sometimes she exhaustedly fell completely asleep, sitting heavily entirely on the cheap sofa. At her tiny desk, entirely, in the absolute middle of answering a highly important work call. She would violently wake completely up with a massive start, highly disoriented, her massive heart violently racing, absolutely having zero idea exactly where she was, or exactly what time it actually was. Her soft hands aggressively began to violently tremble. Highly tiny, terrifying tremors that actively made it incredibly difficult to securely hold a simple fork, to flawlessly type, to actively do absolutely anything that aggressively required absolute steadiness. She aggressively dropped highly fragile things completely constantly. A cheap glass entirely in the tiny kitchen that violently shattered completely onto the hard floor. The expensive phone violently slipping entirely from her shaking fingers. The cheap remote control aggressively falling completely off the small coffee table. Every single time, she stared blankly entirely at her own shaking hands, exactly as if they completely belonged entirely to someone else. The beautiful babies rapidly became significantly bigger, incredibly more highly active. She physically felt them absolutely all the time now, actively rolling, aggressively kicking, violently pressing completely against her fragile ribs. Sometimes it violently hurt. Sometimes it completely stole her very breath. She would gently press her soft hand exactly on the spot and whisper incredibly softly, directly to them, desperately pleading with them to be slightly gentle, to generously give her massive space that she absolutely did not have to give. One highly frustrating afternoon, she was desperately attempting to flawlessly tie her cheap shoes. A highly simple, basic task that had violently become impossibly, terrifyingly difficult completely, with the massive belly entirely in the absolute way, when her shaking fingers absolutely refused to cooperate. They violently trembled way too incredibly much. The cheap laces aggressively kept completely slipping. She aggressively tried again, and again, completely until the blinding, massive frustration violently boiled completely over, and she tragically ended up violently crying, sitting heavily entirely on the hard floor of her pathetic apartment, completely, utterly incapable of actively tying her own damn shoes. "Get it completely together," she whispered fiercely entirely to herself. "You absolutely have to get it together." But actively getting it together aggressively required massive energy that she absolutely did not possess. After that horrific incident, she absolutely only wore cheap slip-on shoes. She aggressively avoided absolutely anything that strictly required highly fine motor skills. She violently simplified her entire, pathetic life completely down, entirely to the absolute, bare essentials. Aggressively answering heavy phones, desperately sleeping exactly when she could, brutally surviving the early labor. The blinding, highly agonizing pain violently started exactly one late afternoon. It aggressively began highly low, entirely in her fragile back, then violently wrapped completely around, entirely, to her massive stomach, aggressively tightening, slowly releasing, violently tightening. Just Braxton Hicks contractions, she desperately told herself. Highly normal, fake practice labor. Except, it absolutely wasn't normal. She had obsessively read absolutely all the highly complex pregnancy books. She profoundly knew the absolute critical difference entirely between fake practice contractions and the incredibly terrifying real ones. These physically felt incredibly, terrifyingly real. "Absolutely not yet," she whispered frantically, entirely to her massive belly. "It is way too incredibly early. You are absolutely not completely ready yet." The tiny babies absolutely did not listen. They absolutely never, ever listened. The blinding pain violently worsened exactly as the late afternoon aggressively progressed. Significantly sharper. Infinitely more highly frequent. She desperately tried to aggressively work. She frantically attempted to flawlessly answer the highly important calls, aggressively coming completely in. But she violently had to completely stop, entirely mid-sentence, exactly when a massive contraction violently hit, fiercely gripping the hard edge of the cheap desk until it agonizingly passed. "I am incredibly sorry." She panted heavily directly into the phone. "Can you please securely hold for exactly 1 moment?" The highly annoyed callers were initially highly patient, then highly confused, then increasingly, incredibly worried. "Are you perfectly okay?" one concerned woman asked. "Perfectly fine," she completely lied. "Just perfectly fine." By the absolute fall of night, she literally could not remain physically upright. She exhaustedly made it completely to the cheap sofa, heavily lay entirely on her side, desperately breathing entirely through the blinding pain. It was actively coming entirely in massive, highly rhythmic waves now. Highly regular, utterly relentless. She frantically counted the agonizing seconds completely between the massive contractions. She desperately tried to flawlessly time them exactly as the complex book explicitly said. Exactly 5 short minutes entirely apart. Then more. Then exactly 3. Way too incredibly fast. Absolutely everything was violently happening way too incredibly fast. "Please," she whispered brokenly. "Please. Absolutely not yet." She frantically reached completely for her expensive phone. It was actively resting entirely on the small coffee table exactly mere inches completely away. She aggressively stretched entirely out. Her soft fingers highly gently brushed the hard edge. She frantically attempted to securely grab it. Another massive, incredibly violent contraction brutally hit her significantly harder than absolutely all the previous ones combined. A terrifying, crushing vice violently squeezing her fragile waist. She screamed loudly. Her shaking hand violently jerked completely back entirely on pure instinct, and the expensive phone violently slid completely off the small table. She clearly heard it violently hit the hard floor. She clearly heard it aggressively slide completely under the heavy sofa. "No!" she gasped frantically. "No, no, no!" She desperately attempted to violently move. She frantically tried to aggressively reach completely under. But the blinding pain was way too incredibly much. Her traumatized body was violently fighting completely against itself. The massive contractions, the crushing weakness, the pure, unadulterated exhaustion, absolutely all violently combining completely into something massive that she absolutely could not successfully overcome. She violently slid completely off the heavy sofa directly onto her weak knees. She frantically crawled directly toward the massive sofa, aggressively reaching her shaking hand completely under, her trembling fingers frantically searching completely in the thick dust and absolute darkness. The massive contractions were actively coming significantly faster now. She could literally barely successfully breathe completely between them. Her blurred vision was aggressively darkening entirely at the absolute edges. She was violently sweating and violently trembling completely at the exact same time. "Help!" she cried out loudly. Her weak voice was incredibly faint, barely audible. "Someone please aggressively help me!" But the highly cheap walls were incredibly thick. The happy couple directly next door had completely left. The highly rundown building was completely, terrifyingly silent. Another massive contraction. The absolute, most horrific one yet. She violently curled completely and entirely on herself. Her sweating forehead violently pressed directly against the hard floor, her shaking hands fiercely clutching her massive stomach. She physically felt something highly warm and wet completely between her legs. Bright red blood, or amniotic fluid, or absolutely both. She absolutely did not know. She physically tasted strong, metallic copper. Blood. She had violently bitten her own tongue completely, without actively realizing it. The tiny room was aggressively spinning. The cheap ceiling fan directly above rotated incredibly slowly, highly hypnotically. She intensely watched it actively spin. She frantically counted the slow rotations, completely lost absolute track, and desperately started completely over again. "I am so incredibly sorry," she whispered brokenly directly to the tiny babies. "I am so incredibly, profoundly sorry." She deeply thought entirely about Logan, about exactly how he had violently left her, about exactly how he absolutely did not know, about exactly how, if she violently died right here, completely alone, entirely on this filthy floor, he would absolutely never, ever, fully know exactly what he had violently abandoned. He would absolutely never, ever know that he actually had biological children. He would absolutely never know they even miraculously existed. He would happily, arrogantly continue completely with his massive, elite life, genuinely thinking he had flawlessly made the absolute right decision. The highly terrifying darkness entirely at the absolute edges of her blurred vision aggressively spread. Incredibly soft. Almost highly welcoming. Exactly like peacefully falling completely asleep. Exactly like violently letting go completely. She clearly heard her own weak voice, incredibly small and highly desperate, loudly echoing entirely in the massive empty room. "Please, absolutely not yet." Then, absolutely nothing. The heavy silence violently stretched incredibly long and utterly complete. The absolute only sound was the cheap fan inactively spinning, and her highly shallow breathing aggressively becoming significantly more incredibly shallow. The neighbor's loud dog aggressively began to violently bark, incredibly loud, highly persistent. It violently barked and barked and barked completely until the highly annoyed neighbor finally, aggressively, came completely out to explicitly see exactly what was violently wrong. He stood perfectly still, entirely in the dark hallway. He clearly heard something highly disturbing completely through the thin door. A highly terrifying sound, a highly pained moan. Something completely, horribly wrong. "Hello!" the terrified neighbor loudly called out. "Are you perfectly okay actively in there?" Absolutely zero response. "I am urgently calling emergency services right now," the neighbor violently yelled. Interactive question. "Sophia is in critical condition. Do you think the doctors can save her and the twins? Share your hopes and prayers below." The fight for survival. The highly piercing, deafening wail entirely of the massive ambulance siren was the absolute first thing she faintly registered. Incredibly distant completely at first. Then significantly closer. Then absolutely, completely deafening. Someone was violently screaming. Highly urgent hands aggressively entirely on her weak body. Blindingly bright lights. Movement way too incredibly fast. "We are actively, violently losing her!" someone violently yelled. The highly terrified voice was incredibly urgent, highly professional, completely terrified. She desperately tried to actively speak, to explicitly tell them that she was absolutely still right there, absolutely still fiercely fighting. But the heavy words absolutely refused to physically come. The massive siren screamed loudly exactly as they aggressively raced completely through the massive city. Securely inside the highly advanced ambulance, her weak heartbeat violently flickered entirely on a glowing monitor. Incredibly weak, highly irregular, aggressively fading exactly like a dying light, slowly, violently going completely out. The highly frantic paramedic aggressively continued explicitly talking entirely to her, urgently telling her to fiercely hold completely on, loudly saying that they were almost exactly there. But his terrified voice aggressively faded completely away, violently vanishing exactly like absolutely everything else. She deeply thought entirely about the tiny babies, about beautiful Benjamin and Matthew, the beautiful names she had fiercely chosen, about whether they would miraculously survive completely without her, about whether Logan would absolutely ever know they miraculously existed, about whether absolutely any of this truly, genuinely mattered. The heavy doors entirely of the massive ambulance violently burst completely open. Blindingly bright lights aggressively rushing by, highly urgent voices violently overlapping completely. They were rapidly moving her, violently lifting her, aggressively rushing her entirely to somewhere. Then absolutely nothing. Just the highly slow, absolute fade entirely into terrifying pitch-black darkness. And the absolute last, agonizing thought she had completely before absolutely everything violently went pitch black was, he will absolutely never, ever know. Logan will absolutely never, ever fully know exactly what he violently left completely behind. In the highly terrifying space entirely between absolute life and violent death, the toxic past miraculously becomes the absolute only future. The highly secure delivery room was pure, unadulterated chaos miraculously disguised entirely as advanced medicine. Elite doctors and highly exhausted nurses aggressively moved completely with highly synchronized, blinding urgency, their highly sharp voices incredibly cutting and highly efficient, violently shouting complex numbers and highly advanced medical terms that explicitly meant absolute life or violent death. The heavy air was incredibly thick, entirely with massive tension, completely with the highly sharp, metallic smell of bright red blood, completely with the highly desperate, frantic energy entirely of highly skilled people violently fighting completely against time itself. Dr. Montgomery was stationed perfectly completely at the absolute center, entirely of absolutely everything. Her highly skilled hands completely steady, entirely despite the massive, bloody chaos, aggressively bringing completely into the massive world exactly 2 tiny babies who tragically arrived completely silent and terrifyingly blue. She had successfully delivered literally hundreds of tiny babies entirely in her elite career, perhaps even thousands. But these specific 2 physically felt incredibly different, significantly heavier, exactly as if the massive, crushing weight entirely of their brave mother's absolute loneliness had miraculously been violently transferred entirely to them. The absolute first tiny twin violently came out completely limp. Absolutely no loud cry. Absolutely no movement. Absolutely none of the highly reassuring, beautiful pink flush of new life. A highly frantic nurse aggressively rushed him completely to a highly advanced warming table, desperately working completely with highly practiced desperation. Immediate suction, aggressive stimulation, high-flow oxygen. Her highly skilled hands aggressively moved incredibly fast, highly professionally, but her terrified face clearly showed the massive, terrifying strain entirely of violently fighting completely against the absolute inevitable, of desperately attempting to violently convince fragile life to actively enter a tiny body that absolutely hadn't completely decided if it was truly worth fiercely fighting for. The absolute second tiny twin rapidly followed incredibly fast, just as terrifyingly silent, just as terrifyingly still. Another frantic nurse, another highly advanced warming table, another highly desperate, massive fight completely against violent death. Exactly 2 incredibly tiny, fragile bodies that absolutely should have possessed agonizing months, significantly more, to beautifully grow, to magically strengthen, to flawlessly prepare entirely for the massive world they had been violently forced completely into, way too incredibly soon. And completely on the massive delivery table, she was violently bleeding completely out. "Critical pressure is violently dropping!" someone violently screamed. "Exactly 80, completely over 40. She is actively, violently crashing. Immediately hang another massive unit," Dr. Montgomery violently ordered, her highly authoritative voice violently cutting entirely through the massive chaos, exactly like a highly sharpened blade. "And aggressively bring me the critical lab results right this exact second." The bright red blood was violently flowing way too incredibly fast. Her traumatized body had aggressively given absolutely everything it possibly had to miraculously bring these tiny babies entirely into the world. And exactly now, it was actively surrendering. It was violently giving completely up. Her highly erratic heart rate violently stuttered entirely on the glowing monitor, exactly like a massive car engine violently dying. Her rapid breathing was incredibly shallow, highly rapid, the exact terrifying kind that explicitly signifies that the traumatized body is fiercely fighting entirely to survive, but is catastrophically losing the massive battle. The massive machines completely around her violently screamed highly terrifying warnings that absolutely everyone entirely in the sterile room profoundly understood, but absolutely no one wanted to explicitly acknowledge. They had vividly seen it exactly before, way too incredibly many times. A highly traumatized body violently pushed significantly beyond its absolute physical limits. A brave woman who had heavily carried way too incredibly much massive weight, completely alone. A highly complex system violently shutting completely down entirely because it absolutely had nothing significantly more left to give. "Doctor, the tiny babies are absolutely not responding!" Dr. Montgomery violently looked completely up. On the absolute other side of the massive room, exactly two incredibly tiny, fragile bodies lay completely still, directly under bright, warming lights that actively made their highly translucent skin appear even significantly more incredibly fragile. Exactly two highly exhausted nurses actively working incredibly frantically, their highly skilled movements aggressively becoming significantly more urgent, significantly more highly desperate, entirely with every single agonizing second that violently passed. Exactly two innocent children completely suspended, entirely between this massive world and the absolute next. Violently trapped entirely in that highly terrifying, dark space, exactly where advanced medicine could absolutely only do so incredibly much, and the absolute rest heavily depended entirely on massive forces completely outside of absolutely anyone's strict control. "Aggressively keep actively working," Dr. Montgomery stated firmly, her highly authoritative voice aggressively commanding. "Do absolutely not magically stop. Do absolutely not dare to completely stop." She had tragically lost fragile patients entirely before. It was an absolute, highly unfortunate part of the grueling job. An absolute part of actively being an elite doctor entirely, in a massive world, exactly where absolutely not everyone could be miraculously saved. But she was absolutely, 100% not going to violently lose this one. Absolutely not this fierce mother. Absolutely not these beautiful babies. Absolutely not this specific night. She aggressively turned directly back completely to her dying patient. The brave woman who had highly tragically arrived completely alone, who had heavily carried twin babies entirely without massive support, who had violently collapsed and miraculously almost died entirely before absolutely anyone miraculously found her. The brave woman whose official admission forms were completely, pathetically, blank. Entirely, except for highly basic information. Absolutely no family. Absolutely no friends. Absolutely no one, anxiously waiting entirely for her, completely in some sterile waiting room, frantically wondering if she would miraculously survive. The brave woman whose traumatized body was exactly now violently failing entirely in absolutely every single measurable way. "We desperately, urgently need significantly more massive blood," Dr. Montgomery violently yelled. "Aggressively check the massive database. Rapidly find a highly compatible massive donor." A highly stressed tech, a young, terrified man with violently shaking hands named Tech Turner, was absolutely already aggressively typing entirely on the advanced computer. His highly skilled fingers violently flew completely over the complex keyboard entirely, with the massive speed that actively comes completely from aggressively doing it way too incredibly many times. Way too incredibly many horrific emergencies. Way too incredibly many frantic searches entirely for rare blood that would miraculously save fragile lives. Or tragically not. What exactly is her specific blood type? A negative. Turner's skilled fingers violently flew. Agonizing seconds violently passed. Way too incredibly many massive seconds. He frowned incredibly deeply. He frantically clicked. Aggressively searched. Frowned significantly deeper. His tense shoulders violently tightened entirely in a highly specific way that explicitly told Dr. Montgomery the highly terrifying answer completely before he even opened his mouth. "Doctor, we officially possess a massive, catastrophic problem." Dr. Montgomery absolutely did not look completely up entirely from her highly desperate work. Her highly skilled hands absolutely still frantically attempting to violently stop the massive bleeding that absolutely refused to completely stop. Bright red blood violently pooling significantly faster than they could possibly safely replace it. "Speak!" There is absolutely zero matching match entirely in the massive database. A negative is incredibly, terrifyingly rare. We absolutely do not possess nearly enough entirely in stock. And absolutely all the massive regional blood banks are completely, utterly depleted. There was a highly catastrophic, massive highway accident significantly earlier today. Multiple severe casualties. They violently wiped us completely clean, then aggressively widened the massive search. Violently go completely national if you absolutely have to. That will actively take massive time that we absolutely do not have. The glowing monitor violently beeped a highly terrifying warning. Her critical blood pressure violently plummeted completely again. "Exactly 60, completely over 30. Critical!" The exact terrifying kind of low numbers that explicitly mean mere minutes. Absolutely not long hours. The exact terrifying kind of low numbers that explicitly mean aggressively preparing entirely for the absolute worst. Dr. Montgomery fiercely made a massive, life-altering decision. The exact kind of highly critical decision that flawlessly separates highly good doctors completely from absolute, elite greats. The exact kind that violently bends strict rules, but miraculously saves fragile lives. Aggressively review her highly confidential records, official emergency contacts, distant family, absolutely anyone who could highly possibly be a highly compatible match. An elite nurse, Nurse Page, entirely with incredibly kind eyes, highly rapid hands, and a massive, stellar reputation entirely for absolutely never, ever giving completely up, aggressively grabbed the thick admission file. She rapidly flipped completely through the highly pathetic, almost completely blank pages. Absolutely no family explicitly listed. Absolutely no close friends. Absolutely zero massive support system completely at all. Just exactly one lonely woman, entirely alone, completely in the massive world, actively facing the absolute greatest, most terrifying challenge of her entire life, entirely without absolutely anyone to fiercely hold her soft hand. "There is absolutely nothing completely here," Paige stated. Massive frustration violently bleeding completely into her terrified voice. She had vividly seen way too incredibly many struggling women exactly like this. Way too incredibly many highly lost people who violently fell completely through the massive cracks. She tragically arrived completely alone. Absolutely all the official forms are completely blank. Completely except she completely stopped. She aggressively squinted entirely at the thick page. Intensely looked significantly closer. Except there is a highly old, highly outdated emergency contact entirely in the highly secure hospital system, completely from a previous old visit. Logan Vance, explicitly listed as her legal husband. But there is a highly specific note perfectly here. Divorced. He actively divorced her. The highly outdated contact is completely obsolete. She highly likely completely forgot to aggressively update it. Dr. Montgomery intensely looked directly at the dying woman, entirely on the bloody table. Then, directly at the two tiny, fragile twins, violently fighting entirely for pure life, completely on the absolute other side of the massive room. Then, directly at the highly critical blood pressure numbers that aggressively continued to violently drop, exactly like heavy stones entirely in deep water. Then completely at the massive, terrifying choice that absolutely wasn't really a choice completely at all. "Violently call him," she ordered aggressively. "Call him right this exact second." Nurse Paige violently hesitated. Her strict, highly rigorous training explicitly told her to absolutely not aggressively contact toxic ex-husbands. That a brutal divorce explicitly meant violently cutting absolutely all ties. That the highly toxic past absolutely must strictly stay entirely in the past. If he violently divorced her, I literally do not care if he ruthlessly left her. I literally do not care if he brutally shattered her fragile heart. I literally do not care if he absolutely never, ever desperately wants to vividly see her again. I absolutely, fiercely care entirely about miraculously keeping this brave woman and these beautiful babies completely alive. Make the damn call. Nurse Paige aggressively snatched the heavy phone, frantically found the highly secure number entirely in the massive system, rapidly dialed completely with violently trembling fingers, and softly whispered a highly desperate, quiet prayer entirely under her breath. It loudly rang, and rang, and rang. In the highly secure neonatal corner, exactly one of the tiny babies suddenly made a highly faint sound. A highly tiny, wet, desperate gasp. Then a highly faint, but completely present, beautiful cry. Exactly like a tiny, fragile kitten, desperately mewing entirely for its mother. The highly skilled nurse actively working entirely on him, a highly seasoned veteran who had vividly seen literally hundreds of premature, dangerous births and profoundly knew exactly which ones would miraculously pull through and which tragically wouldn't, rapidly looked completely up, entirely, with massive, pure relief. "We officially have one!" she loudly called completely out. "Baby A is actively, beautifully breathing!" The absolute second tiny baby miraculously followed exactly mere moments later. Another tiny gasp. Another beautiful, faint cry. absolutely both incredibly weak, absolutely both violently struggling, but miraculously alive, fiercely fighting, beautifully proving that pure life desperately wanted to fiercely continue, even exactly when absolutely all the massive odds explicitly dictated that it absolutely shouldn't. Dr. Montgomery generously permitted herself exactly one microscopic second of pure, unadulterated relief, exactly one massive moment to profoundly acknowledge that at the absolute very least, the tiny babies possessed a highly fighting chance. Then she violently turned completely back entirely to the dying mother, whose absolute final chance was violently slipping completely away entirely with every single weak heartbeat, with every single precious drop of bright red blood that violently pooled exactly where it absolutely shouldn't. Still absolutely no response entirely on that critical call. Nurse Page violently shook her head, her sharp jaw aggressively clenched entirely with massive tension. It violently went completely to secure voicemail. I am aggressively trying it completely again. She frantically redialed. It loudly rang. The ignorance of the wealthy, on the absolute other side of the massive city, securely inside a highly exclusive luxury restaurant entirely in Tribeca, brilliantly illuminated with incredibly dim romantic lights and highly expensive vintage wine. Logan Vance was confidently sitting entirely at a VIP table, completely with Miles Preston, highly enthusiastically celebrating the massive, toxic freedom that he had arrogantly, blindly convinced himself he desperately wanted. His expensive phone violently vibrated entirely on the polished table. Unknown number. He glanced highly casually at it and aggressively flipped it completely face down. Highly likely just pathetic spam. Or a completely wrong number. Absolutely nothing that couldn't easily, safely wait. Is absolutely everything perfectly fine? Miles Preston asked, elegantly raising his expensive crystal glass. Perfectly fine, Logan stated smoothly. Simply pathetic spam. Highly likely. The expensive phone violently vibrated completely again. Incredibly popular tonight, Miles Preston stated completely with a highly toxic smirk. Do you desperately want to aggressively answer that? Logan intensely looked directly at the glowing phone. Unknown number completely again. But it was highly likely simply just pathetic telemarketers. Someone desperately attempting to aggressively sell him something highly useless that he absolutely did not desperately need. No, he stated confidently. It can absolutely wait. In the massive delivery room, Nurse Page violently hung up, frantically redialed completely again. She fiercely held the heavy phone entirely against her ear, exactly like a highly sacred prayer. Exactly like a highly desperate lifeline, violently thrown completely into freezing, dark waters, frantically hoping that absolutely someone would aggressively grab it. Come completely on, she whispered frantically. Answer the damn phone. Please, just violently answer. The luxury restaurant was incredibly loud. Highly sophisticated conversations, and bright laughter, and the elegant clinking of expensive crystal glasses. The beautiful sound of wealthy people happily enjoying their perfect, flawless lives, while entirely somewhere completely on the absolute other side of the massive city, absolutely someone was violently, agonizingly dying. Logan desperately attempted to fully concentrate entirely on exactly what Miles Preston was actively saying. Something highly complex entirely about massive celebrations and highly lucrative future corporate plans and the massive, global world they were aggressively building. But his intense attention aggressively kept violently drifting completely back, directly to the silent phone. It violently vibrated for an absolute third consecutive time. You absolutely should aggressively answer that, Miles Preston stated, his toxic smile rapidly fading completely into genuine, massive concern. Exactly 3 consecutive calls in a row could highly likely be incredibly important. Logan aggressively grabbed the expensive phone. The exact same unknown number. Exactly 3 rapid calls completely in a row. That absolutely wasn't pathetic spam. That was something completely else. Something incredibly urgent. Something massive that violently squeezed his stomach completely with a highly primal, instinctive dread. "Excuse me completely," he stated, rapidly standing completely up. "I absolutely must actively take this." He confidently walked directly toward the grand entrance of the luxury restaurant, smoothly zigzagging completely between expensive tables entirely filled with wealthy, happy people who absolutely did not know that completely on the absolute other side of the massive city. Exactly 2 beautiful lives violently hung completely by a highly fragile thread. Exactly 3 beautiful lives. He aggressively pressed the expensive phone entirely against his ear. "Hello." The highly professional voice completely on the absolute other side was incredibly calm, but highly, highly urgent. Professional, but incredibly, violently desperate. The exact highly trained voice of someone who had flawlessly learned exactly how to brutally deliver highly horrific news, completely without violently breaking down. "Am I officially speaking directly to Mr. Logan Vance?" "Yes. Who exactly is this?" "I am Nurse Page, completely from Manhattan General Hospital. I am highly urgently calling entirely regarding your legal wife." Logan, completely, violently, stopped walking. The massive noise of the luxury restaurant entirely faded completely into highly distant fuzzy static. The entire, massive world violently shrank completely down entirely to absolutely just that specific voice, that exact moment, that completely, utterly impossible declaration. My wife? I absolutely do not possess a wife. I legally, permanently divorced her. Yes, sir. We officially possess that highly specific note explicitly on file. But your specific name is absolutely still officially listed as her absolute primary emergency contact. Sir, I desperately need you to intensely listen incredibly carefully. Your ex-wife is actively, violently dying. Your newborn, biological twin sons are incredibly, barely stable. She possesses the highly rare A-negative blood type. We absolutely do not possess nearly enough entirely in stock. We have frantically, aggressively searched absolutely everywhere. Every single regional blood bank, every single elite hospital. You are the absolute, only person explicitly listed entirely in her massive file. Logan physically felt the entire, massive world violently tilt completely off its axis. Wife. Ex-wife. Sons. Twins. The heavy words made absolutely zero logical sense. They absolutely did not connect completely to absolutely anything real. They absolutely did not seamlessly fit entirely into the highly arrogant story he had toxically told completely to himself entirely about aggressively moving on, beautifully starting completely over, and violently leaving the highly toxic past completely behind. "I absolutely do not completely understand," he stated blankly. "I desperately, urgently need to explicitly know your exact blood type, Mr. Vance, right this exact second. A negative," he stated highly automatically, exactly as he completely stopped. He profoundly, horrifyingly understood. The massive pieces violently clicking completely together, exactly like a highly complex lock violently bursting wide open. Oh, my absolute God! Nurse Page's highly trained voice was incredibly firm, powerfully anchoring him. The exact voice of someone who had brutally delivered this exact type of horrifying news entirely before. Who profoundly knew exactly how to forcefully prevent traumatized people from completely, violently falling apart. Absolutely only your massive blood can miraculously save your ex-wife and your newborn twin sons. The identical sons he absolutely didn't know miraculously existed. The expensive phone felt incredibly, massively heavy, entirely in his shaking hand. Directly behind him, Miles Preston was loudly calling his name, highly concernedly asking if absolutely everything was perfectly fine. Directly in front of him, the heavy restaurant doors were completely wide open, the freezing night air aggressively rushing completely in, violently bringing freezing rain and the sharp smell of wet pavement. He had violently left her. He had ruthlessly divorced her. He had cruelly told her that she was violently holding him back, and she had actively been heavily carrying his biological children. He fiercely made a massive, life-altering decision. "I am aggressively on my way right now," he stated firmly. "Explicitly tell me exactly where." The race against death. Some highly urgent calls violently arrive way too incredibly late. Some miraculously arrive exactly, perfectly, when they absolutely must. Logan stood completely frozen, completely outside the luxury restaurant. The expensive phone aggressively pressed entirely against his ear, frantically attempting to violently force his brilliant brain to successfully work, desperately trying to logically process heavy words that made absolutely zero sense. Heavy words that absolutely could not possibly be real. "Violently repeat it," he stated. "Explicitly say it completely again." Nurse Page's highly professional voice came through incredibly firm and highly clear. Professional, but incredibly urgent. The exact voice of someone who had brutally delivered highly impossible news entirely before. "Your ex-wife is officially in highly critical condition, completely following a highly dangerous emergency premature delivery entirely of identical twin boys. She is violently hemorrhaging and desperately needs a massive blood transfusion. A negative is incredibly rare. We absolutely do not possess nearly enough entirely in stock. You can successfully donate." "Twins," Logan repeated blankly. The heavy word physically felt incredibly strange, entirely in his dry mouth. Completely impossible. Exactly like a highly complex foreign language he had absolutely never, ever learned to successfully speak. "Yes, sir." Exactly how incredibly old. They were literally just violently born exactly mere minutes ago. Logan's brilliant mind violently raced completely backward, entirely at maximum speed. The brutal divorce had formally happened a highly specific time ago. The absolute last time he had intimately been entirely with her was completely before that. Completely before he arrogantly told her he desperately needed to violently leave. Completely before he arrogantly convinced himself that she was aggressively holding him back before. Oh my absolute God. She had been heavily pregnant, exactly when he violently left her. Heavily pregnant, exactly when he ruthlessly told her that their beautiful marriage was completely, permanently over. Heavily pregnant, exactly when he confidently walked completely away, arrogantly, thinking he was beautifully freeing himself. She had actively been heavily carrying his biological children. "Are they definitely mine?" he asked softly, even though he absolutely already profoundly knew the absolute, undeniable answer. The highly exact timing, the highly rare blood type, absolutely everything. "Sir." I absolutely cannot legally answer that specific question. Exactly what I can explicitly tell you is that a brave woman is violently dying, and exactly 2 fragile babies are barely stable, and you are the absolute only person explicitly listed who could highly possibly help. Can you urgently get directly to the massive hospital right now? Directly behind him, Miles Preston suddenly appeared completely in the heavy doorway. Massive concern deeply etched entirely on his handsome face. Logan, is absolutely everything perfectly fine? Logan aggressively raised a massive hand. Wait, absolutely not right now. Explicitly tell me exactly where. Nurse Page rapidly gave him the highly specific address. Manhattan General Hospital, the massive emergency entrance. I am aggressively leaving right now. He violently hung up and abruptly turned completely toward Miles Preston. His massive hands absolutely already frantically searching entirely for his highly expensive coat. I absolutely have to go. What exactly happened? What the hell was that? I absolutely cannot completely explain. I just urgently have to leave. Logan violently pushed directly past him completely, back entirely into the luxury restaurant. The massive noise and the heavy heat violently hitting him exactly like a solid brick wall. He aggressively snatched his expensive coat completely from the plush chair, exactly where he had comfortably been sitting, exactly mere moments before. Exactly when his absolute biggest corporate worry was something he absolutely couldn't even clearly remember right now. Miles Preston aggressively followed him, his deep voice rising completely with pure confusion and highly toxic worry. Talk to me. What the hell is actively happening, Logan? My ex-wife, Logan stated, his massive hands violently trembling exactly as he frantically shoved his arms completely into the expensive coat. The luxury fabric felt incredibly, massively heavy. Absolutely everything felt highly crushing and heavy. She is in the massive hospital. She just had... He literally could not successfully finish. He absolutely could not physically make it completely real. I urgently have to go. I am aggressively coming directly with you. No. Logan's deep voice was incredibly cutting, then significantly softer, profoundly realizing that he was violently unleashing his blinding panic entirely on someone who was simply attempting to help. No. Thank you. I desperately need to actively do this completely alone. He aggressively threw massive amounts of cash completely onto the expensive table. Way too incredibly much. He literally didn't care a single bit. He absolutely didn't meticulously count it, and he violently stormed completely out of the luxury restaurant, directly into the freezing night. The massive city was violently alive, completely around him. Massive cars and highly busy people, and blindingly bright lights. Normal, beautiful life, aggressively continuing completely on. Entirely, while his absolute own life had literally just violently exploded entirely into tiny, microscopic fragments that he absolutely could not even begin to miraculously piece completely back together. He stood completely frozen, entirely on the wet sidewalk, frantically trying to remember exactly where he had highly expensively parked. His brilliant mind was completely blank, utterly empty, completely filled entirely with highly noisy static. His massive hands absolutely would not stop violently trembling. Twins, his identical twins. She had actively been heavily pregnant exactly when he violently left her. Heavily pregnant exactly when he ruthlessly told her she was the absolute anchor, violently preventing him completely from aggressively moving forward. Heavily pregnant exactly when he arrogantly signed those heavy papers and confidently walked completely away, genuinely thinking he was flawlessly doing the absolute right thing, and she had absolutely never, ever told him. Why the hell didn't she explicitly tell him? The highly toxic question violently burned entirely in his brilliant mind, exactly like highly corrosive acid. Then the absolute brutal answer instantly arrived, exactly as highly corrosive and burning. Because you violently left her. Because you aggressively made it highly, brutally clear that you absolutely no longer wanted her. Because you violently shattered her fragile heart and confidently walked completely away. Why the hell would she explicitly tell you absolutely anything? He frantically found his massive car. Finally, he violently unlocked it entirely with wildly trembling fingers. Smoothly slid directly behind the heavy steering wheel. The massive engine violently roared to life, and he aggressively pulled completely out directly into heavy traffic, completely without even properly checking his mirrors. A highly angry horn violently blared directly behind him. He literally didn't care a single bit. He absolutely couldn't fiercely care entirely about absolutely anything. Completely, except actively arriving. The massive hospital was completely on the absolute other side, entirely of the massive city. He would aggressively make it significantly faster than humanly possible. The digital speedometer rapidly climbed. 40, 50, 60. The wet streets violently blurred. Bright lights violently streaking exactly like highly explosive shooting stars. He aggressively ran a solid red light. Then, absolutely another. A highly erratic taxi violently swerved. The angry driver violently screaming something highly toxic that Logan absolutely didn't even hear completely through the thick, closed windows. He aggressively kept driving. His expensive phone violently vibrated entirely on the plush passenger seat. Miles Preston calling. He violently ignored it. Absolutely all he could deeply think entirely about was her. Completely alone. Heavily pregnant, entirely with his biological children. Agonizingly going through absolutely all of it, completely without him. Entirely because he arrogantly told her he desperately needed to strictly focus entirely on himself. Entirely on his massive future. On aggressively building something that genuinely mattered. And she had absolutely been exactly what truly mattered the absolute most. The freezing rain violently started exactly as he aggressively merged completely onto the massive highway. First a highly light drizzle, then significantly harder. The freezing drops violently hitting the heavy windshield, exactly as if desperately attempting to brutally shatter it. The highly advanced wipers beat frantically completely against the thick glass. Faster. Significantly faster. Absolutely not nearly fast enough. He deeply thought entirely about the absolute last time he had vividly seen her in that heavy courthouse. The exact, agonizing way her soft hand had violently trembled exactly when signing the toxic papers. The exact way she had violently struggled so incredibly hard to flawlessly keep herself entirely together. The exact way she had beautifully looked entirely at him exactly one final time, completely, before gracefully walking out. She had been heavily pregnant, actively carrying his biological children, and he had ruthlessly allowed her to permanently leave. His massive hands aggressively gripped the heavy steering wheel so incredibly tight that his knuckles turned pure, bone white. His sharp jaw violently ached completely from aggressively clenching so hard. What the hell have I actively done? The massive guilt was utterly crushing, highly physical, exactly like a massive, heavy weight entirely on his chest that actively made it incredibly difficult to successfully breathe. Exactly as if someone massive had violently sat completely on his lungs and aggressively refused to ever move. The heavy traffic was incredibly dense, completely, despite the highly late hour. Bright red brake lights aggressively stretched completely ahead, entirely, in a highly endless line of highly annoying obstacles. Logan violently slammed his massive palm completely against the steering wheel, entirely in pure frustration. Frantically looked completely for a tiny gap. Successfully found it. Aggressively crossed exactly 2 lanes completely without highly using his signal. Significantly more angry horns. Significantly more toxic anger. He violently ignored absolutely all of them. His brilliant mind aggressively kept endlessly replaying highly horrific scenarios. Her horrifyingly discovering she was heavily pregnant completely after he had already violently left. Bravely deciding absolutely not to explicitly tell him. Heavily carrying the fragile twins completely alone. Actively going directly to scary doctor's appointments completely alone. Physically feeling them beautifully move completely alone. Miraculously, almost violently, dying completely alone. Absolutely all entirely, because he toxically decided she was violently holding him back. The massive exit aggressively approached incredibly fast. He violently took it way too incredibly sharp. The heavy tires loudly screeching completely on the freezing wet pavement. The massive car violently skidded slightly. He flawlessly corrected completely without actively thinking. His highly advanced muscle memory, successfully taking absolute control exactly when his highly conscious mind was way too incredibly scattered to logically focus. The bright city lights beautifully reflected entirely on the wet pavement. Absolutely everything looked highly distorted and incredibly surreal. Exactly as if he were actively driving completely through a highly terrifying nightmare that he absolutely could not successfully wake completely up from. His expensive phone violently vibrated completely again. He quickly glanced directly at it. Another highly frantic call, entirely from Miles Preston. Then a highly urgent message. "Whatever the hell is actively happening, I am absolutely here if you desperately need me." Logan absolutely did not respond. He literally couldn't successfully respond. There were absolutely 0 adequate words entirely for exactly what was actively happening. There was absolutely no logical way to explicitly explain that he had ruthlessly abandoned his heavily pregnant wife. That he had arrogantly told her she was violently holding him back entirely while she was heavily carrying his biological sons. That he might have actually, violently, killed her entirely with his own toxic selfishness. The massive hospital violently loomed completely ahead. A highly massive, imposing building, completely with way too incredibly many bright windows, and highly urgent emergency lights violently flashing entirely at the massive entrance, exactly like a highly terrifying beacon. Exactly like a highly severe warning. Exactly like a massive promise. He violently turned completely into the emergency drop-off area entirely at a highly sharp angle. Aggressively parking incredibly crookedly. Completely taking up exactly 2 massive spaces. He literally didn't care a single bit. He absolutely wasn't actively thinking entirely about proper parking. Or correct spaces. Or strict rules. He violently leaped completely out of the massive car entirely before the heavy engine had even completely shut off. He frantically ran entirely through the freezing rain, his expensive designer shoes aggressively splashing completely in the freezing puddles. The highly automatic doors violently opened way too incredibly slow. He aggressively squeezed completely sideways through, his broad shoulder violently scraping the hard frame. Inside, the massive emergency room was absolute, controlled chaos. Highly exhausted people desperately waiting entirely in cheap plastic chairs. Elite nurses frantically moving completely with high purpose. Advanced machines loudly beeping. A highly terrified child violently crying, entirely somewhere. Absolutely someone aggressively arguing entirely with the busy receptionist completely about long wait times and highly complex insurance and massive things that seemed incredibly, ridiculously trivial, entirely right now. Logan confidently went directly straight to the front desk, his massive chest heavily heaving completely from the frantic run. I am officially Logan Vance. I literally just received a highly urgent call. My wife, my ex-wife, is actively here. She desperately needs massive blood. The elite nurse rapidly looked completely up entirely from her computer, her highly professional expression instantly shifting completely from highly routine directly to absolute, high alert. She intensely studied him entirely for exactly 1 microsecond, intensely noticing his highly rain-soaked, expensive clothes and wildly terrified eyes. Then she fiercely nodded. "Are you officially the compatible donor?" "Yes, a negative. Exactly where do I actively go?" "Follow me immediately." She smoothly rounded the massive desk and aggressively led him directly through heavy double doors, entirely into a long hallway that aggressively smelled entirely of sharp antiseptic, pure fear, and highly desperate hope. They confidently moved incredibly fast, rapidly passing highly private rooms, completely with drawn curtains, heavily hiding highly private tragedies. Rapidly passing elite doctors, quietly conferring entirely in highly low voices, completely about random people Logan would absolutely never, ever, personally know. Passing absolutely all of that, Logan's massive heart violently hammered entirely in his chest. His highly expensive shirt was completely soaked, entirely with freezing rain and thick sweat. His massive hands absolutely still violently trembling. He aggressively shoved them completely into his deep pockets to cowardly hide them. "Is she?" he nervously began. "Is she actively going to be perfectly fine?" The elite nurse absolutely did not explicitly respond immediately. She simply aggressively continued walking, her highly comfortable shoes loudly squeaking completely on the polished floor. Finally, the elite doctors are aggressively doing absolutely everything they possibly can. That absolutely wasn't a comforting answer. It was a highly evasive dodge, a highly calculated non-answer that elite medical professionals expertly gave exactly when the absolute, true answer was way too incredibly terrible to explicitly say entirely out loud, which explicitly meant that massive things were incredibly, catastrophically bad. Highly, terrifyingly bad. Which explicitly meant that he might have actually violently killed her completely by ruthlessly leaving her. They completely stopped directly outside a highly secure room. Entirely through the thick window, he could clearly, visually see highly frantic movement. Elite medical staff entirely in green scrubs. Highly advanced machines completely with bright flashing lights. A massive table completely with absolutely someone heavily lying entirely on it. Completely surrounded entirely by complex tubes and massive wires, and the highly desperate machinery entirely of advanced modern medicine. Her. His heavy breath violently caught completely in his chest. "Strictly wait right here," the elite nurse stated firmly. "Absolutely someone will aggressively come entirely for you." She rapidly disappeared completely through the heavy door. Logan remained completely alone, entirely in the sterile hallway. Intensely looking directly through the thick window at a highly horrific scene, he literally could not completely comprehend. He could barely, faintly see her. Just a highly brief, terrifying glimpse, her incredibly pale, beautiful face entirely against pristine white sheets. Her fragile body, so incredibly, terrifyingly still. completely surrounded entirely by frantic people, desperately attempting to miraculously save her life entirely, while he stood completely outside, exactly like a pathetic stranger. Because he absolutely was. He had aggressively, voluntarily become exactly one when he confidently walked completely away. The heavy door smoothly opened. Nurse Paige aggressively stepped out. She looked incredibly exhausted, highly worried, but incredibly focused, highly determined. "Mr. Vance, yes, thank you so incredibly much for fiercely coming. We desperately need to aggressively move incredibly fast. Come completely with me." She aggressively led him directly to a tiny, highly efficient room, entirely at the absolute end of the long hall. Highly efficient, incredibly sterile. A highly comfortable donation chair exactly in the absolute center. Advanced medical equipment completely ready and eagerly waiting. Exactly as if they had been meticulously preparing entirely for. Exactly as if his highly anticipated arrival was the absolute, final missing piece they had been desperately waiting entirely for. "Sit directly down," she stated firmly. He heavily sat. She rapidly rolled entirely up his expensive sleeve. She flawlessly found a prominent vein completely with highly practiced, elite efficiency. The highly sharp prick entirely of the needle barely even registered completely through the massive toxic guilt, violently coursing entirely through his system. "This will actively take exactly a few short minutes," she stated, meticulously adjusting the thin tube. "Desperately try to completely relax." Relax. The heavy word was absolutely absurd. He almost violently laughed. Relax. Entirely while the beautiful woman he had violently abandoned was actively, agonizingly dying entirely at the absolute end of the hallway. Entirely while his biological sons, his sons, were violently fighting entirely for their absolute first, tiny breaths, completely in some highly secure other room. Entirely while his absolute entire massive world was violently restructuring itself, completely in a highly terrifying shape that he absolutely did not recognize. He intensely watched his bright red blood violently flow completely through the thin tube. Bright red and incredibly alive. Completely unstoppable. A massive part entirely of him actively traveling directly toward her, directly toward them, miraculously connecting him completely back entirely to the beautiful people he had arrogantly thought he could effortlessly leave completely behind. "The tiny babies," he whispered softly. "Are they? They are actively breathing," Nurse Paige stated, her voice incredibly soft. "Highly weak, but miraculously breathing. The absolute, true, massive concern is entirely your ex-wife. She violently lost way too incredibly much blood." Logan nodded fiercely. He literally could not speak. The massive guilt violently choked him. He intensely watched his blood actively leave his body. He intensely watched it flawlessly disappear completely into a massive collection bag that would be rapidly carried directly to her, miraculously put entirely inside her, to miraculously keep her completely alive. His bright red blood entirely in her veins, exactly as if they were beautifully connected completely again. Exactly as if the brutal divorce he had aggressively pushed completely for had absolutely never, ever happened. Exactly as if he could magically take absolutely everything completely back. But he absolutely couldn't. The massive catastrophic damage was completely done. He had violently left her exactly when she desperately needed him the absolute most. And exactly now, she was actively dying entirely because of it. "How incredibly much longer?" he asked desperately. Exactly one more short minute. The absolute longest agonizing minute entirely of his entire life. He tightly closed his piercing eyes and desperately attempted to frantically pray entirely to a God he absolutely wasn't completely sure he even genuinely believed in. He frantically attempted to violently make highly desperate deals entirely with the massive universe. He frantically attempted to fiercely promise that he would absolutely be significantly better, that he would aggressively do significantly better, that he would flawlessly be the absolute true man he absolutely should have been the entire damn time. If absolutely only she miraculously survived. If absolutely only the tiny babies miraculously survived. If absolutely only he were generously given exactly one more beautiful chance that he absolutely, undeniably, did not deserve. The advanced machine loudly beeped. Massive donation completely finished. Nurse Page incredibly carefully removed the sharp needle, firmly pressed a soft gauze entirely onto his arm, flawlessly secured it completely with gentle, elite precision. Firmly maintain massive pressure right here. Do absolutely not aggressively move way too incredibly fast. You might highly likely feel incredibly dizzy. Can I vividly see her? Absolutely not yet. Let's aggressively allow the massive transfusion to seamlessly begin. Then we will accurately see exactly how she is actively doing. And the tiny babies are securely in the highly secure neonatal intensive care unit, entirely at the absolute end of the long hall. But Mr. Vance, she violently paused, meticulously choosing her heavy words incredibly carefully. Perhaps, highly cautiously take it incredibly slow. This is a massive, highly overwhelming amount to properly process. You literally just horrifyingly found out that you are the biological father of identical twins, and their brave mother is violently fighting entirely for her life. That is incredibly, massively heavy. She aggressively grabbed the heavy blood bag and rapidly left. The heavy door softly clicked completely shut. Logan remained sitting heavily entirely in the donation chair, his strong arm violently burning exactly where the sharp needle had been, his massive head violently spinning entirely from the rapid blood loss, the absolute shock, and the pure, unadulterated impossibility, entirely, of absolutely everything that was actively happening. Identical twin boys, his biological sons, innocent children he absolutely did not know miraculously existed completely until tonight. And her, the beautiful woman he had fiercely loved, the exact woman he had violently left, the exact woman who was actively, agonizingly dying completely in a sterile room, entirely at the absolute end of the hallway, entirely because she had aggressively given absolutely everything to miraculously bring his biological sons entirely into the massive world. Children she had heavily carried completely alone, entirely because he had cruelly told her she was violently holding him back. He violently pressed absolutely both massive hands entirely against his handsome face, and desperately attempted to fiercely breathe completely through the blinding panic and massive guilt aggressively rising entirely in his dry throat. What the hell have I actively done? Interactive question. Logan just donated blood to save Sophia. Do you think this heroic act makes up for him abandoning her? Why or why not? Let us know below. The NICU encounter. Sometimes true. Absolute redemption is absolutely not proudly earned. It is violently, aggressively, bled completely out. The highly sterile donation room was completely, utterly silent. Entirely, except completely, for the highly soft, rhythmic beep entirely of the advanced machine. And the highly soft sound entirely of Logan's bright red blood successfully filling the massive collection bag. Nurse Page actively worked incredibly efficiently, meticulously checking his vital signs, expertly adjusting the thin line, flawlessly ensuring absolutely everything smoothly flowed perfectly well. Her highly skilled movements were incredibly practiced, highly automatic. The absolute flawless result entirely of aggressively doing it literally hundreds of times completely before. Logan intensely stared directly at the sterile ceiling. Pristine white tiles, blinding fluorescent lights. Highly anonymous. The exact type of depressing ceiling that actively exists entirely in sterile hospitals, absolutely everywhere. The exact type you intensely stare at, exactly when your entire massive world violently falls completely apart, and you desperately need something incredibly neutral to fiercely focus completely on. You are actively doing incredibly well, Nurse Page stated incredibly softly. I am. His deep voice sounded incredibly hollow, utterly broken. Because I literally just horrifyingly found out that I ruthlessly abandoned my heavily pregnant wife, that I maliciously let her agonizingly go completely through absolutely all of this completely alone, that she is actively dying entirely because I absolutely wasn't there. Nurse Page absolutely did not explicitly respond immediately. She had clearly heard significantly enough highly desperate confessions, entirely in emergency rooms, to profoundly know exactly when absolute silence was infinitely better than highly pathetic platitudes. Sometimes, deeply traumatized people simply desperately needed to violently say horrific things entirely out loud, completely without absolutely anyone desperately attempting to magically fix them. She absolutely never ever explicitly told me, Logan aggressively continued, his deep voice violently cracking. And I absolutely do not maliciously blame her. Why the hell would she? I arrogantly told her I desperately needed to aggressively move completely on, that I absolutely could not successfully build my massive future completely with her actively in it. I toxically made her physically feel exactly as if she were the massive problem, exactly as if she were violently holding me completely back. Nurse Page, and that absolute entire time, she was actively carrying my biological sons, actively going to scary doctor appointments completely alone, physically feeling their tiny movements completely alone, miraculously, almost dying completely alone. He laughed incredibly, highly bitterly. I am absolutely not doing incredibly well. I am an absolute, highly toxic monster. The advanced machine loudly beeped. The massive collection bag was completely full, bright red and incredibly heavy. Logan's rare blood, their highly vital lifelines, the highly physical, undeniable manifestation entirely of a massive connection he had highly aggressively attempted to violently sever. Nurse Page incredibly carefully removed the sharp needle, firmly pressed a soft gauze entirely onto his arm, flawlessly secured it completely with gentle, elite precision. Firmly maintain massive pressure right here. Do absolutely not aggressively move way too incredibly fast. You might highly likely feel incredibly dizzy. Can I vividly see her yet? No. Let's aggressively allow the massive transfusion to seamlessly begin. Then we will accurately see exactly how she is actively doing. And the tiny babies are securely in the highly secure neonatal intensive care unit, entirely at the absolute end of the long hall. But Nurse Page violently paused, her highly professional expression beautifully softening. Exactly what you violently did, completely by ruthlessly leaving her. That is absolutely entirely between you and her. But exactly what you are actively doing right now, fiercely being right here, bravely donating rare blood, miraculously saving her life, that absolutely also massively matters. Do absolutely not arrogantly discount it. She aggressively grabbed the heavy blood bag and rapidly left. The heavy door softly clicked completely shut. Logan remained sitting heavily entirely in the donation chair, his strong arm violently burning exactly where the sharp needle had been, his massive head violently spinning entirely from the rapid blood loss. The absolute shock, and a massive crushing guilt so incredibly heavy that he could literally barely successfully breathe completely under it. Identical twin boys, his biological sons. Innocent children he absolutely did not know miraculously existed. Beautiful children she had heavily carried completely alone entirely because he had toxically made her physically feel incredibly unwanted. The heavy door violently opened. Dr. Montgomery confidently walked in. She looked incredibly exhausted. Her pristine medical coat was heavily stained completely with bright red blood. His rare blood. Her blood. The tiny baby's blood. Her highly professional face was incredibly drawn, but she was actively standing completely upright. That absolutely had to explicitly mean something massive. Mr. Vance. He violently stood up way too incredibly fast. The tiny room violently tilted. He aggressively held securely onto the heavy chair, his massive hand fiercely gripping the hard armrest. She is miraculously alive. The massive transfusion is flawlessly working. Her highly critical blood pressure is aggressively stabilizing. We are absolutely not entirely completely out of the highly dangerous woods just yet, but she is fiercely fighting. Dr. Montgomery intensely studied him completely, with highly sharp, evaluating eyes. You miraculously saved her life. Logan's strong legs physically felt incredibly weak. He heavily sat completely back down, exactly as if absolutely someone had violently cut his strong strings. And the tiny babies are officially stable. They were tragically born highly prematurely. They will desperately need massive time entirely in the secure NICU. Highly aggressive monitoring, constant support. But they are actively breathing completely on their own. They are incredibly strong, exactly like their brave mother. Can I? His deep voice violently cracked. He aggressively cleared his tight throat. He desperately tried completely again. Can I vividly see them? Yes, but there is something massive you absolutely must profoundly understand first. Dr. Montgomery smoothly pulled the other cheap chair significantly closer and sat heavily directly, entirely in front of him. Your ex-wife tragically arrived entirely here, completely alone. Absolutely zero family. Zero support. Absolutely no one explicitly listed entirely in her massive file, completely except you. And that was highly outdated information, entirely from completely before the brutal divorce. She has been actively doing absolutely all of this, completely, utterly alone. Heavily carrying high-risk twins, brutally working, miraculously surviving absolutely everything completely alone. I absolutely did not know, Logan stated incredibly quietly. I absolutely did not know she was heavily pregnant. I am absolutely 100% sure you absolutely didn't. But you are the exact arrogant man who violently left. You are the exact man who aggressively demanded the brutal divorce. And she is the exact woman who tragically paid the massive, agonizing price entirely for that toxic decision. Those beautiful children securely in there are absolutely yours, biologically. The advanced DNA is completely, undeniably clear, entirely by the rare blood typing. Exactly what you actively do completely with that massive information is your absolute own choice. But they are absolutely here. They are incredibly real, and they desperately need absolutely someone. Dr. Montgomery confidently stood up. Deeply think entirely about it completely before you vividly see them. Because exactly once you confidently cross that heavy door, exactly once you vividly see their beautiful faces, you will absolutely never be able to unknowingly unsee it. You will absolutely not be able to violently leave completely again. Not completely without profoundly knowing exactly what you are aggressively abandoning this time. She quietly left. Logan remained completely alone, entirely. In the sterile donation room. The massive, crushing weight entirely of her heavy words, violently pressing completely down on him, exactly like a massive physical force. They are absolutely yours. He slowly, agonizingly stood up, walked heavily entirely to the door, stepped completely out, entirely, into the sterile hallway. An elite nurse, absolutely not Paige. Someone significantly younger, completely with highly kind eyes, vividly saw him and gently pointed. The highly secure NICU is directly over there, the heavy door completely on the right. Logan obediently followed the gentle directions. His heavy feet physically felt completely disconnected entirely from his massive body, exactly as if he were actively floating, exactly as if absolutely none of this was incredibly real, and entirely at absolutely any moment he would violently wake up completely in his luxury penthouse and profoundly realize that absolutely all of it was a highly terrifying dream. But the blinding fluorescent lights were way too incredibly bright, entirely to be a fake dream. The sharp, antiseptic smell way too incredibly sharp. The blinding fear entirely in his chest way too incredibly real. The highly secure NICU was located completely behind massive glass walls. Inside, highly sterile rows entirely of advanced incubators, fiercely held incredibly tiny humans, completely in highly various, fragile stages of pure survival. Tiny babies significantly smaller than he had absolutely ever genuinely thought physically possible. Fragile babies, violently fighting entirely for every single tiny breath. He frantically found the elite nurses' station. He literally didn't know exactly how to correctly say it. I am officially here entirely for the Vance babies. The elite nurse smiled radiantly. She genuinely, truly smiled. The beautiful twins, please, confidently, come directly this exact way. She safely led him entirely to exactly 2 advanced incubators, perfectly side by side. Securely inside each one, impossibly, terrifyingly tiny, lay the fragile babies. Complex tubes and massive wires intimately connected them entirely to highly advanced machines. Glowing monitors loudly beeped highly steady, rhythmic rhythms, but completely beneath absolutely all the highly complex medical equipment. Completely beneath absolutely all the advanced machinery actively keeping them miraculously alive. Logan could vividly see them. His biological sons. They were incredibly, terrifyingly tiny, highly fragile. Their soft skin was incredibly thin and bright red, almost completely translucent. Their beautiful eyes were tightly closed. Their tiny fingers were so incredibly small, but absolutely, flawlessly perfect. Absolutely, utterly perfect. This is officially Baby A, the elite nurse stated softly, gently pointing directly at the advanced incubator, completely on the left. And this is officially Baby B. They absolutely haven't been formally named yet. Do you absolutely know if the brave mom had beautiful names already picked out? Logan violently shook his massive head. He literally could not successfully speak. He literally could not successfully breathe. Can I gently touch them completely through the small ports? Yes, exactly like this. She meticulously showed him exactly how. He He incredibly carefully extended his shaking hand completely through the small opening entirely in the advanced incubator. His massive hand visually looked incredibly, terrifyingly huge, directly next to the tiny baby. Completely, utterly overwhelming. He gently, softly, touched the incredibly tiny hand completely with exactly one single finger. Barely a highly fragile whisper of physical contact. The tiny baby's fragile fingers miraculously uncurled, flawlessly wrapped completely around his massive finger, fiercely held completely on, entirely with a highly surprising, massive strength. Logan's dry throat violently closed completely up. Hot tears that he absolutely didn't even know he had been desperately holding completely back, violently spilled completely over, blisteringly hot and utterly unstoppable. "Hello?" he whispered brokenly. "Hello? I am." He literally could not successfully say it. He absolutely couldn't aggressively claim it yet. "I am your true father, and I am so incredibly, profoundly sorry. I am so incredibly sorry entirely for absolutely not being right there. I am so incredibly sorry entirely because your brave mom desperately had to actively do all of this completely alone." The tiny baby fiercely held his massive finger, incredibly small, highly trusting, miraculously alive, entirely thanks completely to the rare blood that Logan had literally just aggressively given. Beautifully connected, entirely in profound ways that went significantly deeper than he could absolutely ever comprehend. Logan slowly, incredibly carefully moved directly to the absolute second incubator. Baby B. He gently extended his shaking hand completely through the small port. Softly touched the incredibly tiny hand. This one absolutely also fiercely grabbed his massive finger. Fiercely held completely, on entirely, with that exact same, highly surprising, massive strength, entirely for something so incredibly fragile, so incredibly brand new completely to the massive world. "You guys are absolute fierce fighters," Logan stated incredibly softly, hot tears violently streaming completely down his handsome face. "Absolutely both of you. Exactly like your brave mom. The brave mom that I violently abandoned. The brave mom who miraculously, almost violently died actively bringing you entirely into the massive world entirely, because I absolutely wasn't there to fiercely help her." He remained standing perfectly there, completely, with absolutely both massive hands fiercely holding his biological sons. And he generously permitted himself to fiercely feel the absolute, complete, crushing weight entirely of exactly what he had violently done, exactly what he had violently lost, exactly what he had miraculously, almost violently, destroyed. "I honestly do not know if she will absolutely ever forgive me," he whispered incredibly softly directly to them. "I honestly do not know if she will absolutely ever desperately want to vividly see me again, but I fiercely promise you both, I fiercely promise, absolutely both of you, that I am absolutely never, ever leaving completely again. I am absolutely right here now, and I am actively going to aggressively spend the absolute rest of my entire life desperately trying to completely make up, entirely, for violently abandoning you." "Mr. Vance," Nurse Page suddenly appeared directly at his broad side. "Your ex-wife is officially awake." Logan intensely looked directly at the tiny babies exactly one final time, meticulously memorized their beautiful faces, their incredibly tiny hands, the exact beautiful way they visually looked incredibly peaceful, completely, despite absolutely all the complex tubes and massive wires. Then he incredibly carefully, gently, pulled his massive fingers completely out, entirely from their tiny grasps. Tiny. Take me directly to her. The forgiveness of blood. They confidently walked completely down the sterile hallways, entirely in absolute silence. Logan's massive heart was violently beating way too incredibly fast. What exactly would he say? Exactly how could he possibly explain something exactly like this? Exactly how could he pathetically apologize entirely for something so incredibly, massively enormous? Nurse Page completely stopped directly outside a heavy door. She is incredibly weak. Be highly, incredibly gentle. And Mr. Vance, she absolutely does not completely know that you are actively here. She absolutely does not know that you aggressively donated rare blood. She genuinely, truly believes that she miraculously survived completely alone. Exactly whatever you explicitly choose to tell her, make it absolutely count. She smoothly opened the heavy door. The highly private room was incredibly dim. The advanced machine softly, highly rhythmically beeped, and perfectly on the massive bed, incredibly pale, but miraculously breathing, was the exact beautiful woman he had violently left. She was deeply asleep, her beautiful face peacefully turned entirely toward the large window. The freezing rain aggressively streaked completely down the thick glass outside. The exact same freezing rain he had frantically driven completely through to aggressively get entirely here. The massive city aggressively continuing, completely, utterly indifferent entirely to massive miracles. Logan confidently approached incredibly slowly, exactly like cautiously approaching something incredibly sacred, something highly fragile that might violently disappear completely if he aggressively moved way too incredibly fast. He could vividly see the heavy IV line securely in her soft arm, the advanced monitors meticulously tracking her critical vital signs, the absolute, undeniable evidence entirely of exactly how incredibly close she had tragically come entirely to permanently leaving this massive world, to violently taking his biological children completely with her. He desperately wanted to actively speak, to loudly say her beautiful name, to actively say something. But his deep voice absolutely did not successfully work. The heavy words violently caught completely in his dry throat, exactly like massive stones. So he simply stood perfectly there, intensely watching her beautifully breathe, intensely watching the highly steady rise and fall entirely of her soft chest, intensely watching her miraculously live, his rare blood entirely in her fragile veins, miraculously keeping her entirely here, miraculously keeping her completely with their beautiful children, beautifully connecting them entirely in profound ways that the toxic divorce papers absolutely could not successfully break. An elite nurse quietly brought a cheap chair. Logan sat heavily down. He absolutely didn't explicitly plan to aggressively stay incredibly long, just entirely until she beautifully woke completely up, just entirely until he could vividly see her beautiful eyes magically open and profoundly know that she was truly, genuinely okay. But the massive, crushing exhaustion violently hit him exactly like a massive tidal wave. The massive blood donation, the frantic race completely through the freezing rain, the absolute blinding shock of absolutely everything, the crushing massive weight entirely of toxic guilt. Absolutely all of it violently crashed completely down on him entirely at once. His massive head heavily dropped, his piercing eyes tightly closed, and he exhaustedly slept completely without actively meaning to. his massive hand resting heavily entirely on the absolute edge of the massive bed, desperately reaching completely out entirely for something he had violently thrown completely away, something he arrogantly thought he absolutely didn't want, something that miraculously turned completely out to be his absolute entire universe. Some heavy silences flawlessly contained significantly more than pathetic words absolutely ever possibly could. Logan violently woke completely up to the highly rhythmic sound of advanced machines loudly beeping, and absolutely someone actively moving completely in the sterile hallway. His thick neck violently ached completely from the highly awkward angle entirely in which he had exhaustedly slept. The cheap chair was incredibly uncomfortable, explicitly designed entirely for highly short, brief visits, absolutely not entirely for agonizing, night-long vigils.